There is a sound, not music, not voices, not anything outside. It is the sound your mind makes the moment the world goes quiet, a low hum beneath the stillness. Something that feels less like a noise and more like a presence, waiting, patient, just below the surface. You may be lying down right now. The room is dim. The day has finally stopped asking things of you. And yet, something inside has not quite followed. Some small engine keeps turning. Some corner of your attention keeps reaching for the next thought, the next task, the next thing to hold. Most people call that restlessness, a problem to solve, a sign that something is wrong. But there is another way to understand it. A French mathematician named Blaise Pascal sat in a cold room in Paris more than 300 years ago, sick and exhausted and too honest for his own comfort, and he came to a different conclusion. He did not think the restlessness was a flaw in you. He thought it was the most important thing about you. Tonight, we are going to follow Pascal into that room, not to arrive at tidy answers, not to walk away with a plan, just to understand what he found there. Not theories, not arguments, but something stranger and quieter, a portrait of what it means to be human when there is nothing left to do, when the world has gone still, when the only thing remaining is you. He called this condition, this constant, almost involuntary fleeing from ourselves, diversion, and he believed it explained almost everything. Why we stay busy when rest is available. Why we reach for our phones in the middle of the night. Why a perfectly good evening can still end with the feeling that something was missing. Why even our best days sometimes leave us staring at the ceiling, wondering what is not quite right. Pascal was not a mystic. He was a scientist. He built mechanical calculating machines when he was still a teenager. He proved the existence of the vacuum when most of Europe insisted that was impossible. He was precise, skeptical, and deeply impatient with comfortable lies. And yet, at the center of his most important work, a book he never finished, a collection of fragments found scattered in a box after his death, he wrote something that had nothing to do with mathematics. He wrote that all of humanity's problems can be traced to a single source. Not war, not poverty, not injustice. Our inability to sit quietly, alone, in a room. That observation has been traveling through centuries to find you tonight. There is something in the way it lands, not as a clever saying, but as a quiet recognition that tells you Pascal was not speaking about other people. He was speaking about you, about the part of you that fills every silence with sound. That checks the phone not because there is anything to check, but because stillness has become unfamiliar. That keeps some noise running in the background, not for the content, but for the company it provides. This is not a character flaw. This is the oldest human habit there is. Tonight, we are going to understand it, not judge it, not erase it overnight. Just understand it, the way you understand an old habit whose roots you have never quite followed all the way down. There are two kinds of silence. Pascal understood them both. And by the time this night is over, you will know the difference. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Let your breath settle where it is. We are not in a hurry. The story begins, as so many honest stories do, not with a great discovery or a dramatic event, but with a man sitting in a room, trying to understand why he could not stop moving and finding, in that stillness, the strangest and most human answer. Chapter 2. Diversion begins early. Think of a child who cannot sit still. Not a troubled child, just an ordinary one. The kind who fidgets through dinner, who fills every quiet moment with sound, who cannot pass through a room without touching something. We say they have energy. We say they are curious. We smile and think they just have so much life in them. And that is true. But Pascal would have noticed something else. He would have noticed that even very young children, given a moment of total quiet with nothing to do and no one watching, sometimes look around with an expression that is not contentment. It is something closer to unease, a private searching, the eyes moving from corner to corner, looking for something to attach to. We call it boredom. Pascal called it the beginning of something much larger. He believed that diversion, the instinct to fill silence with activity, to move before we have to stop and feel, is not something we learn from busy culture or too many screens. It is woven into the fabric of what we are. It begins in the earliest years of life and never quite stops. It simply gets more sophisticated. A child reaches for a toy, an adult reaches for a phone. The motion is the same. The need is the same. What changes is only the complexity of what we reach for. Pascal grew up in a household that hummed with intellectual life. His father educated his son personally, and by his early teens, young Blaise had already worked through complex geometric proofs on his own, using charcoal on tiles, without having read a single book on the subject. He was the kind of mind that could not stay empty. But he was also, from early on, the kind of body that could not stay well. Headaches that lasted for days. A digestive weakness that made it painful to eat. A fragility that shadowed him his entire short life. He worked in brilliant bursts and then collapsed into illness. And in those stretches of forced stillness, he began to observe something deeply uncomfortable. When his mind had nothing to solve, it did not simply rest. It reached. It circled. It grew uneasy. And here is the small detail that changes everything. Pascal did not interpret that unease as a problem of concentration. He interpreted It is a problem of honesty. When the mind goes quiet and then grows restless, something true is trying to surface. Something that the constant motion of daily life, the tasks, the conversations, the distractions, had been successfully keeping below the waterline. Most of us learn very early on how to keep that something submerged. We learn through 100 small lessons that no one intended to teach. When we cried as infants, something appeared to soothe us. When we were sad as children, something appeared to distract us. When we were anxious as teenagers, something appeared to fill the space. We learned, without anyone saying the words, that discomfort was something to be replaced, not witnessed. We became very good at replacement. Think of someone you know, or perhaps yourself in a certain season, who filled every moment, from waking to sleeping, a podcast while showering, music in the car, news at lunch, sport in the evening, and then, when the lights went off and the house went quiet, the thoughts arrived that had been waiting all day. That person does not think of themselves as running. They think of themselves as engaged, as productive, as full. Pascal would have recognized them immediately, and he would not have judged them, not at all, because the person who stays busy is doing exactly what humans instinctively do. They are diverting. They are filling the space before the truth can take shape. But what is the truth? That is the question buried deep in Pascal's papers. That is what we are here to find. He wrote something else, something buried deeper in his fragments, a confession that explains why even the wisest, most self-aware people cannot quite stop running. We will reach it, but not yet. For now, let your body settle into what is holding you. Feel the weight along your back, your legs, your hands. You have done enough today. The reaching can rest for a while. The story is still unfolding. Chapter 3. Why silence feels dangerous. Try to imagine this. An afternoon entirely free. No obligations. No one who needs anything. The phone silent, the calendar empty, several hours of nothing required of you. For some people, that sounds like paradise. For many more, it produces a subtle, almost physical discomfort, a low anxiety that is difficult to name, an itch that keeps appearing even though nothing is wrong. Even though by most measures everything is fine, Pascal noticed this. He wrote about it with a precision that still feels unsettling. He observed that people, educated, comfortable, well-fed people, will go to remarkable lengths to avoid being alone with themselves. They will seek entertainment they do not enjoy, just to have something to do. They will start arguments rather than sit in peace. They will invent tasks that do not need doing just to stay in motion, not because they are broken, because silence has become dangerous. And here is why. When we go quiet, things surface. Not always dramatic things, not always the big, unresolved questions of a life. Sometimes it is smaller, a conversation we never finished, a choice we made that we have not examined too carefully, a version of ourselves that we have been too busy to visit. The noise of daily life is partly functional. We genuinely have things to do, but it is also partly protective. The busyness shields us from questions that have no comfortable answers. Questions like, is this the life I actually wanted? Am I becoming who I meant to be? What am I most afraid of, and have I been moving toward it or away? These questions do not arrive when we are busy. They are patient. They wait. They arrive in the quiet. And somewhere along the way, many of us made an unconscious bargain. Stay busy enough, and the questions will not come. Stay entertained enough, and the silence will not have to speak. Pascal understood this bargain. He also understood its cost. Because the questions do not disappear just because we do not sit with them. They do not dissolve into the noise. They go underground, into the body, into the breath, into the restlessness that rises at night when we finally have no more diversions to deploy. That is why a good day can end with bad sleep. Not because something went wrong, but because the day was so full that nothing unresolved had any room to breathe, and now it is all breathing at once. There is a room inside you that you have been avoiding, not a dramatic room, not a room full of horrors, just a quiet room where certain truths wait, patient and unhurried. For the moment, you are ready to sit down with them. Pascal spent much of his adult life in that room, not always comfortably. He was sick for long stretches, confined to bed, unable to move. He could not always choose stillness, but he could choose honesty about what he found there. And what he found was not despair. It was recognition. A clear-eyed understanding of the human condition that felt, to him, more honest than any comfort he had been offered. He believed that seeing ourselves clearly, even if what we see is difficult, is a form of dignity that our diversions constantly steal from us. Silence is not dangerous because of what it contains. It is dangerous because of what it reveals. And what it reveals, Pascal insisted, is not your worst self. It is something more surprising. Something both smaller and larger than we usually allow ourselves to be. Let your jaw soften for a moment. Let the next breath arrive on its own. We are in no hurry here. The room we are building toward tonight is not a room of judgment. It is a room of recognition. And in that room, something strange happens. The pressure that sent you running from silence begins to ease. Not because the questions are answered, but because you finally stopped running long enough to notice they were never as frightening as the running itself. That understanding is still a little way ahead, but you are already much closer than you think. Chapter 4: The Restless Heart before Pascal, there was Augustine. More than 1,000 years before Pascal was born, a North African bishop sat in his study in the city of Hippo and wrote one of the most famous sentences in the history of Western thought. He was describing his own spiritual journey, the decades of searching, the running toward pleasure, the running toward ambition, the running toward anything that might fill the ache he had always carried. And then the words arrived, almost too simple to be so true. Our heart is restless until it rests in something beyond itself. Augustine was writing about God. Pascal was writing about something both narrower and wider than that. He was writing about a human condition so fundamental that it does not require any particular theology to recognize it. You do not have to share Pascal's faith to feel what he is describing. You just have to be human. You just have to have ever lain awake in the small hours wondering why the restlessness will not leave. Pascal believed the human heart has a specific shape, and that shape creates a specific problem. We are, he wrote, creatures who contain something infinite, a capacity for wonder, for love, for longing, for beauty that has no natural ceiling. We can imagine perfection. We can conceive of the eternal. We can ask questions so large that no answer has ever been adequate to contain them. And yet we live in finite bodies, in finite time, surrounded by finite things. That gap between what we can imagine and what we can hold is the source of the restlessness. It is not a dysfunction. It is the signature of what we are. Think of it this way. A cup designed to hold an ocean will always feel empty when filled with a glass of water. Not because there is something wrong with the cup, because of the scale of what the cup was made for. Pascal believed human beings are that cup, and the diversions we pursue, the entertainment, the status, the accumulating, the scrolling, the constant filling of silence are our attempts to use 1,000 glasses of water to satisfy something that was made for the ocean. They do not fail because we are choosing the wrong diversions. They fail because no finite thing was ever meant to fill this particular space. And here is the quiet detail that changes how this lands. Pascal was not writing this to make us despair. He was writing it to explain something we have all experienced but never quite had the language for. That feeling of having everything and still feeling something missing. That particular loneliness that arrives not in poverty or failure, but precisely in the moments of comfort and success. He was saying, that feeling is not a sign that you are ungrateful. It is not a sign that you are broken. It is a sign that you are human. Specifically human, in a way no other creature is. A dog at rest is simply at rest. It does not lie awake asking what its life means. It does not scroll through memories of the past year, wondering if it spent time well. The restlessness that haunts us is not an animal problem. It is a human one. And Pascal, for all his precision, found something unexpectedly tender in that. He thought the restlessness was our greatness as much as our burden. The sign that we are reaching for something real even when we cannot name it. The sign that we are not satisfied with surfaces. Even when surfaces are all we can see, notice the weight of your body against what is holding you. Let your breath slow, just slightly. The restlessness you feel tonight is not a verdict. It is a signal. And like any signal, it is worth understanding before you try to silence it. That understanding is exactly what we are building. Slowly, without hurry. One idea at a time. Chapter 5. Addiction to distraction. There is a small device most of us carry everywhere. You may have looked at it within the last hour. You may have looked at it in the last 10 minutes. If it is within arm's reach right now, there is some part of your nervous system aware of its presence, even as you try to rest. This device is the modern world's most complete expression of what Pascal called diversion. He could not have imagined it. He lived in a world of slow letters and candlelight and horse travel. But if you describe to him what a smartphone does, the endless scroll, the variable reward of new notifications, the way it provides stimulation precisely calibrated to prevent the mind from ever having to settle, he would have nodded without surprise. He would have recognized the mechanism immediately, because Pascal was not writing about the specific forms that diversion takes. He was writing about the function, and the function is always the same: to keep the self occupied enough that it does not have to meet itself in the quiet. What neuroscience has confirmed in the last few decades is that the mechanisms Pascal described philosophically are biological realities. The brain releases dopamine, that neurotransmitter associated with anticipation and reward, not just when we receive something pleasurable, but when we expect to. The scroll works not because what we find is always interesting, but because the anticipation of finding something interesting never quite stops. Each refresh is a small gamble. And gamblers, as any behavioral scientist will tell you, are not kept at the table by winning. They are kept by the variable ratio of winning sometimes. Pascal wrote about this without knowing the chemistry. He described the way a man will hunt not for the pleasure of the quarry, but for the pleasure hunting. He noticed that when hunters actually caught what they were chasing, they were often inexplicably disappointed. The mood, the satisfaction, the sense of being fully alive, all of that lived in the pursuit, not the arrival. We recognize this immediately in our own lives. There is a way of finishing the scroll without finding anything satisfying, and then scrolling again to find what the previous scroll missed. There is a way of finishing a television series and feeling vaguely empty, and then searching immediately for the next one. There is a way of reaching the end of a busy week and filling the weekend with plans, so that the quieter question, "What was all that busyness for?" never quite has room to land. And none of this is stupidity. None of it is weakness. It is the mind doing exactly what it was designed to do in an environment that was not designed for minds. Pascal lived before the modern economy discovered that human restlessness could be monetized. Before entertainment became an industry built on the precise calibration of arousal levels. Before every pocket contained a machine that understood distraction better than we did. But the hunger it feeds is the one he described. The hunger to be occupied, to be stimulated, to feel in the noise and motion that something is happening even when nothing meaningful is. Here is what changes when you understand this. The next time you reach for your phone in a quiet moment, or turn on background noise before the silence can settle, you are not failing at self-discipline. You are doing something profoundly, almost comically human. You are doing what people in every century have done, in whatever form their century provided. Pascal did it too. He buried himself in mathematics, in experiments, in polemical writing, in religious controversy. Only when illness stripped those diversions away did he sit with what remained. And what remained, he found, was the most interesting thing he had ever encountered. Let your hands rest open if they are curled. There is nothing to grip right now, nothing to check. The next thing will be here when you need it. For now, there is only this. Chapter 6. The Room Without Escape. Imagine being told you must spend one afternoon completely alone. No screen, no book, no project, no companion. Just you, a chair, and a quiet room. For most people, that afternoon would not be peaceful. Pascal understood why. He wrote about it with the specificity of someone who had lived it, rather than simply theorized about it. He had observed in himself, in the people around him, in the behavior of the wealthy and powerful men at the court of Louis XIV, that human beings will go to almost any length to avoid this simple situation. They will seek activity, any activity, rather than face the contents of a quiet room. A man who could afford to do nothing will nonetheless fill his days with business, with games, with ceremony, with arguments, not because these things satisfy him, but because they protect him. From what? From himself. This is the center of Pascal's observation. Not that we are afraid of boredom in the way we fear pain, but that the quiet room, once the diversions are removed, becomes something like a mirror, and we are not always ready for what the mirror shows. Think of a man who built his entire life around usefulness. 40 years of work, of showing up, of being needed. He structured his days around the demands of others, the meetings, the decisions, the crises that only he could handle. He told himself that when the work was done, when retirement arrived, he would finally rest. And then the work ended, and the room was quiet. And what arrived in that quiet was not peace. It was a question he had never given himself time to sit with. Who am I when I am not being useful to anyone? The room asked it clearly. He had no rehearsed answer. Pascal would have recognized him immediately. Not as a failed man, as a human man. As someone who, like almost everyone, had organized a life around diversion of a particularly dignified kind, the diversion of being productive, of being responsible, of being the person others relied upon. These are not bad diversions. They are not shallow ones. But they are diversions nonetheless. And when they are removed, what remains is still the same quiet room that Pascal described, the same mirror, the same question. But here is where Pascal diverges from despair. He was not saying that the room is a place of horror. He was saying that it is a place of honesty, that the discomfort it produces is not evidence of emptiness inside you, but evidence of depth. The room feels uncomfortable because you are larger than you have allowed yourself to be in the noise of your days. And the room, with its quiet and its honest mirror, is not your enemy. It is the most real place you have ever been. Most people who have spent any real time in this room, who have sat in the quiet without filling it, who have let the silence show them something they were not managing, describe a similar experience. An initial discomfort followed by something unexpected. Not peace, necessarily, not resolution, but a kind of solidity, the feeling of standing on actual ground, even if the ground is complicated, rather than standing on the pleasant constructed surface that covers it. That solidity is not comfortable in the way that diversion is comfortable, but it is nourishing in a way that diversion never is, and it is always available, not just in monasteries or retreats or special circumstances. In any ordinary room, at any ordinary hour, whenever the willingness to simply be here is present. Pascal spent years trying to communicate this. He could not make it simple because the human resistance to the quiet room is real, and naming the resistance does not dissolve it. But he believed that naming it honestly was the first and most important step. Now notice something about this moment. You are in a room right now. This actual room, wherever you are lying. And there is a version of you that might have reached for something to fill the silence. And instead, you are here, listening, still. That is not nothing. That is already the beginning of what Pascal spent years trying to find. The room without escape becomes, when we stop running from it, simply a room, with nothing in it but the truth of what you are. And the truth, it turns out, is more bearable than the fleeing. Let your breath settle. Let your body be heavy. The mirror is not unkind. It never was. Chapter 7. Boredom and Human Grandeur. Most of us learned, somewhere in childhood, that boredom was a problem. It meant you had nothing to do, nothing interesting enough to hold you. It was an inconvenience to be solved, a gap in the schedule to be filled. Children who were bored were given things. Adults who were bored were encouraged to find a hobby, start a project, stay engaged. We grew up treating boredom as a kind of poverty, an absence of the good things that should be filling our time. Pascal thought this was exactly backwards. He believed that boredom, real boredom, the unmedicated kind, the kind that arrives in a quiet room with no screen and no distraction, is not a poverty at all. It is a form of perception, a sudden, uncomfortable clarity about what is actually here when the noise is gone, and what is here is significant. He wrote about this in terms that might seem strange at first, but become stranger in the best way the longer you sit with them. He said that boredom reveals two things simultaneously. It reveals our misery, the fact that we are small, mortal, limited creatures who cannot sustain contentment through our own efforts alone. And it also reveals our grandeur, the fact that we are unsatisfied by anything less than the infinite, both at once. A dog does not get bored in the philosophical sense. It may grow restless without exercise or stimulation, but it does not lie in the sun and feel, beneath the warmth, an ache it cannot name. That particular ache, the one that arrives when everything is fine and yet something still feels missing, is distinctly human. And Pascal did not think that was shameful. He thought it was magnificent. Consider what boredom actually is when you examine it closely. It is the mind declaring that the available stimuli are insufficient. It is the self saying, I was made for more than this. Not more entertainment, not more productivity, more depth, more meaning, more reality. Boredom, in Pascal's reading, is the mind recognizing its own scale. A person who is never bored, who can be perfectly satisfied by television and small tasks and surface conversation, is not, in Pascal's view, more fortunate than someone who is restless. They are simply not paying attention to the size of what they contain. The restlessness is the signal. It is uncomfortable, yes. Like a compass in the wrong environment, spinning, unable to settle, it can be disorienting. But the compass is not broken. It is simply in a field where magnetic north is not present. And once you understand that the boredom is not a problem, but a direction, something shifts. You stop trying to escape it. You start trying to understand what it is pointing toward. Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who was Pascal's philosophical heir in many ways, wrote about boredom as one of the most revealing experiences available to a human being. He called it the root of all evil, not in a moral sense, but in an existential one. He meant that boredom, genuinely felt rather than immediately escaped, forces a confrontation with the self that most people spend their whole lives successfully avoiding. He thought that was why people were so desperate to fill it. Not because they were lazy or ungrateful, because the confrontation was real. Because what boredom asked you to face, the fact of your own consciousness, your own mortality, your own freedom, and the weight of it, was not a small thing. But he also believed, as Pascal did, that the person willing to sit with the confrontation found something on the other side of it, not answers. Something quieter and more useful, an honest understanding of where they actually were, of what they actually wanted, of what they had been covering with noise. There is a particular kind of Sunday afternoon that many people know. The plans fell through. The house is quiet. There is nothing urgent. And instead of feeling rested, there is a formless unease, a wish that something were happening, even though nothing needs to happen. In that moment, Pascal would say, "You are close to something important." Not because the emptiness is the answer, but because the emptiness is honest. And honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is closer to where you actually live than the comfortable noise that usually surrounds it. Let your mind drift toward that honesty now, gently. You do not need to arrive anywhere. You do not need to name what you find. Just notice that the quiet in this moment is not empty. It is full of you. And that is the beginning of what Pascal meant by grandeur. Chapter 8. Wretchedness without illusion. Pascal had a gift for making uncomfortable observations sound like kindness. He wrote about human wretchedness the way a good doctor describes a condition, not to condemn the patient, but to name what is already there. The naming, he believed, was itself a kind of relief, because the unnamed thing is always larger than the named one. The shadow we cannot see is always more frightening than the one we can. He believed human beings are by nature creatures of contradiction. We are capable of extraordinary love and extraordinary cruelty. We can hold in our minds the concept of eternity and then spend our afternoon in meaningless argument. We can understand beauty with stunning precision and then let envy shrivel it. We are vast enough to imagine transcendence and small enough to be ruined by vanity. We are, in his words, the glory and the refuse of the universe. And he meant that with tenderness, because the wretchedness Pascal described is not moral failure, it is structural. It is built into the gap between what we can imagine and what we can sustain. A creature who can conceive of perfection but who lives in imperfection will always feel, at some level, the distance between the two. That distance is not something we caused by making wrong choices. It is something we inherited by being human. This matters enormously, because many of us spend enormous energy trying to resolve this wretchedness through self-improvement. Through optimizing the schedule, refining the habits, reading the right books, building the right rituals. And these things are not without value. But they cannot close the gap Pascal was describing, because the gap is not a problem of poor execution, it is a problem of scale. The person who has done everything right, who is healthy, productive, loved, purposeful, still lies awake sometimes feeling it. The something that is still missing even when nothing is missing. The ache that has no obvious source, Pascal would say, of course. Not because you have failed, because you are built this way. And here is what he added, which changes everything. He said that the person who can see this, who can name it, who can sit with it without either running from it or being destroyed by it, has arrived at something real, has arrived at a kind of honesty that is, in itself, a form of freedom. Most people move through their lives with a subtle, persistent fear that there is something wrong with them that they have never been able to locate, a formless inadequacy, a sense of not quite measuring up to some standard they cannot name, Pascal would say. That is not inadequacy. That is the human condition, seen clearly. And seeing it clearly is not the same as being defeated by it. The wretched man who knows he is wretched, Pascal wrote, is greater than a king who has no sense of his condition, because the knowledge is itself a kind of elevation. The capacity to see your own smallness is a feature of your largeness. A stone is not wretched. An animal is not wretched. Only a being capable of understanding its own limitations can experience that particular ache. And that same being, in seeing its limitations clearly, demonstrates the very faculty that makes it more than limited. Let your body rest for a moment. Let your breath come slowly. There is nothing in this room that demands you perform contentment. You can simply be here, whatever here is for you tonight, wretched or peaceful, or somewhere between. All of it is human. All of it is honest. And honest is closer to peace than comfortable illusion ever was. Pascal knew this. He spent his whole short life learning to know it. Chapter 9. Stillness as Inner Mirror. When you stop filling the silence, the silence fills with you. Not your best self, carefully curated for the world, not the version of you that performs competence through the working hours or warmth in the evenings. Just you, unedited, unhurried. The actual texture of what you have been thinking and feeling and carrying underneath all the activity. This is what Pascal found in the quiet. And this is why he believed the quiet was more valuable than anything that filled it. He was not a naturally still person. By all accounts, his mind moved at a speed that exhausted the people around him. He jumped between mathematics and theology and social satire and physics and moral philosophy, not because he lacked depth, but because he had too much of it to contain in any single container. He was the kind of thinker who would have thrived in an era of hyperlinks. And yet he kept returning to the question of stillness. Not because it was comfortable for him, because it was honest. He observed something about what happens when a person genuinely stops. The first thing that arrives is often restlessness. The mind reaches for the next task, the next thought, the next stimulation. This is the moment most people fill with whatever is available: the phone, the television, the internal rehearsal of tomorrow's conversations. But if you stay, if you do not reach. The second thing that arrives is something that looks like sadness, but is not quite sadness. It is closer to honesty. A kind of weight that has been present all along, but that the motion of the day has been distributing across enough activity that no single moment had to hold it. In stillness, it gathers. And this gathering, which many people mistake for depression or anxiety, is actually the beginning of something important. It is the self beginning to tell itself the truth about what it is tired of, about what it has been missing, about what it has been pretending does not matter. The inner mirror is not flattering, but mirrors do not flatter. That is what makes them useful. There is a difference between sitting in the quiet and being lectured by it. Pascal was clear about this. The stillness is not trying to condemn you. It is not producing a verdict. It is simply showing you what is actually there in the way a mirror shows your face, without commentary, without interpretation, without judgment. What you do with what you see is your own business, but you cannot do anything meaningful with what you refuse to see. This is the radical honesty at the center of Pascal's philosophy. Not the cheerful honesty of self-help, which tends to find something affirming in every reflection. The harder honesty of a person who has been sick enough and still enough and close enough to his own mortality to stop pretending. He was 31 years old when he had what he called his night of fire, a November evening in 1654. He was in his room and something happened. He described it as an experience of absolute presence, of certainty, of something beyond argument. He sewed a record of it into the lining of his coat and kept it there until his death 8 years later. He changed after that night. Not in a way that erased the restlessness, but in a way that changed his relationship to it. He began to treat the quiet not as something to endure, but as something to enter. The inner mirror, he found, showed something more than wretchedness. It showed also the faint outline of what the wretchedness was reaching toward. Feel the air in this room right now, just its temperature, just its stillness. Notice that you are here, that your body is breathing without your instruction, that the quiet around you is not empty, that something is already present in it, you, exactly as you are. That is enough for tonight. Chapter 10, Anxiety in the Empty Room. There is a particular kind of anxiety that has no obvious source. Not the anxiety of a coming deadline or a difficult conversation. Not the sharp anxiety of bad news. This is softer, vaguer, more persistent. A low hum that arrives when the external noise drops away, when the busyness finally stops, when you would, by all rights, have permission to relax. And instead of relaxing, the hum begins. Pascal understood this anxiety better than almost any thinker before or since. He understood it because he felt it, and because he was precise enough to follow it back to its source instead of simply naming it and moving on. He wrote that this kind of anxiety, this formless, groundless unease, is what appears when diversion is removed, when there is nothing to do and nowhere to be, and the self is left with itself. It arrives not because something is wrong with your life, but because the self in the quiet, immediately begins doing what the self always does when unoccupied. It asks questions, not the practical kind, the deep kind, the kind that do not have answers available on a Tuesday night. Questions about whether the time was spent well, whether the relationships are what they should be, whether the direction of the years is the right one, whether there is time left to do the things that still feel unfinished. These questions are not problems, but they feel like problems because we have no structure in the empty room to contain them. In the daytime, the questions arrive, but there is always something to do before they can settle. The meeting, the meal, the errand, the message, the questions get deferred and deferred again and again. At night, there is nothing left to defer them to. This is why so many people describe the experience of lying down to sleep and feeling the mind accelerate rather than slow. Not because sleep is the problem, because the absence of daytime noise has finally given the deferred questions room to expand. Imagine you spent all day holding your breath without quite noticing, and then you lay down. And your body, finally unguarded, took a deep breath. And the breath felt enormous, so much larger than anything you drew during the day. The nighttime mind is like that breath. All the things that were held shallow through the hours have been waiting for the moment of lowered guard to surface fully. Pascal did not think this was a malfunction. He thought it was the mind trying to be honest with you, trying to bring to your attention what the day could not accommodate. The anxiety in the empty room is not telling you that something is wrong. It is telling you that something is true. And truth, however uncomfortable, is always more useful than comfortable inattention. There is a grounding practice in this. The next time the hum begins, tonight, or any night, try not to immediately replace it with noise or to argue with it or to reason it away. Instead, notice it. Just notice, the way you would notice weather. Not with alarm, but with attention. Ask, what truth is this hum carrying? What has been waiting for this moment of quiet? You do not have to answer the question. You do not have to solve it tonight. But the asking, the simple, honest asking, begins to change the quality of the anxiety, from something formless and threatening into something that has a shape, something that can be seen. And things that can be seen are always smaller than the shadows they cast. Let your body soften, particularly wherever you have been holding without knowing it. The hum is not your enemy. It is your honesty, looking for a quiet room to live in. Tonight, you have given it one. Chapter 11. The Mind That Cannot Rest. It is almost midnight. Or perhaps it is after midnight. Or perhaps you fell asleep an hour ago and woke again, as some nights go. The dark outside is the same dark either way. The quiet house is the same quiet house. And the mind is running, not with joy, not with creative fire, just running. replaying the moment from 2 days ago that you would have handled differently, drafting the response to the email that did not sit right, calculating tomorrow's schedule, rehearsing the conversation that hasn't happened yet, worrying about something that is probably fine, but probably is not the same as certainly. Pascal would have recognized this immediately. He called it the mind's attempt to feel safe through control, when the body is still and the external world offers nothing. To act upon, the mind turns inward and begins performing its most reliable trick. It simulates, it runs scenarios, it prepares, plans, rehearses, reviews. It does this not out of malice, but out of something closer to care, a kind of primitive vigilance that equates thinking with protecting. If I keep thinking about it, the thinking goes, I will catch the thing that might go wrong. I will spot the mistake before it happens. I will be ready. And the thinking never quite finishes because the project of perfect readiness has no finish line. There is a certain kind of exhaustion that comes from this. Not the clean exhaustion of physical labor or creative effort, where the body has genuinely spent something in service of something real. This is the exhaustion of a machine kept running when there is no work for it to do. The kind of tired that sleep does not always fix because it does not begin in the body. It begins in the habit of vigilance. In the deep-rooted belief that the mind must always be doing something, Pascal observed that kings kept entertainers, jesters, musicians, hunts, ceremonies, not primarily for pleasure, but for a specific protection. The king who was left alone with his thoughts, without distraction, without the constant provision of sensation, would quickly arrive at questions his power could not answer. Questions about mortality, about the thinness of the crown's meaning, about whether any of it was worth the effort of maintaining. And so the entertainers were not luxuries. They were necessities. They kept the question from arriving. Most of us are our own entertainers now. We provide ourselves with enough mental content, enough plans and worries and rehearsals and reviews that the deeper question stays just below the surface. And the mind that cannot rest at night is not failing at rest. It is entertaining itself against the question it most dreads. What is the question that changes from person to person? For some, it is about purpose. For some, it is about relationships that have drifted without resolution. For some, it is about the weight of years and whether they have been spent in a direction that still feels true. For some, it is simpler and more immediate, a fear that they have let someone down, a grief they have been carrying without calling it that, a longing for something they cannot name. The mind that cannot rest is not broken, it is honest. Let your breath slow now. Not because the questions are answered, but because you know they are there. And knowing is different from the not knowing that keeps the mind running. The thinking reed rests sometimes, not because the thinking stops, but because it is finally allowed to be what it is, the mind of a living creature doing its imperfect best in the quiet dark. You do not have to solve anything tonight. You are allowed to simply be here. Chapter 12, Overthinking and the Abyss. Pascal had a word for the space inside us that no amount of thinking can fill. He called it the infinite, not as a spiritual abstraction, but as a lived reality. He wrote that humans carry within them an awareness of two abysses, one above and one below. The infinite greatness of the cosmos, which makes us feel small, and the infinite smallness of the atom, which makes the cosmos feel vast. And between those two infinities, he wrote, the human being stands, this strange, brief, conscious creature, aware of both without belonging to either. He did not find this terrifying. He found it defining. Because the awareness of the infinite is not nothing, it is a faculty, a capacity for scale that no other creature seems to possess in quite the same way. When you lie awake, turning a worry over and over, unable to arrive at any resolution, you are not merely anxious. You are bumping against this faculty. The thinking that cannot stop is the thinking that can conceive of a resolution that does not exist in finite terms. You are not overthinking, you are under-situated. The mind is operating in infinite space, without a finite container to rest in. And the modern world, for all its intelligence, is not very good at providing that container. Therapeutic models teach us to challenge the thought, to question the evidence, to rate the probability of the feared outcome. These are useful tools, and genuinely so, but they work at the level of the thought itself. They negotiate with the mind in the mind's own currency. Pascal would say, sometimes the mind cannot be reasoned out of its abyss because the abyss is real. The awareness of mortality is real. The uncertainty of the future is real. The fact that relationships can end and health can fail and time is not unlimited, these are not cognitive distortions to be corrected. They are accurate perceptions. And the mind that keeps returning to them is not malfunctioning. It is being honest. Psychologist Irvin Yalom spent decades working with people facing their own mortality and wrote about something he observed consistently. He found that genuine confrontation with finitude, not the abstract kind, but the real, felt kind, often produced not greater anxiety but less, as though the mind, having finally looked directly at the thing it feared, found it smaller than the looking away had made it. Pascal understood this intuitively. He believed that the person who can sit with the abyss, who can face the infinity above and below without either collapsing or reaching for a diversion, has achieved something real, not peace in the comfortable sense, but a kind of fearlessness born not from confidence but from acquaintance. You are not afraid of the dark when you know what the dark contains. There is something you may have been overthinking for a long time. Some version of the same worry that keeps returning. Some question that loops back regardless of how many times you have addressed it. Pascal would say, it is looping not because you have not thought about it enough, but because you have been thinking about it in the wrong kind of space. The finite mind cannot resolve an infinite question. It can only learn to hold the question differently. not as a problem to solve, as a reality to live with. And living with it simply, honestly, without the drama of resolution, is its own form of rest. Let the question be present tonight. Do not answer it. Do not escape it. Just let it be in the room with you. The abyss is not empty. You are in it, and you are still here. Chapter 13. The Theater of Vanity. There is a performance most of us give without ever deciding to. It begins early, before we have words for it. The smile that appears because someone is watching. The posture that changes when we enter a room. The version of the story we tell depending on who is listening. The careful calibration of how much to reveal, to whom, and in what order. We do not think of this as performance. We think of it as social intelligence, as appropriate self-presentation, as being functional in a world that requires certain masks for certain occasions. Pascal thought something different. He thought the performance was a form of diversion, perhaps the most sophisticated form of all, because it does not just occupy the time, it occupies the self. It fills the space where a more honest encounter with your own nature might otherwise occur. He watched the courtiers of 17th century France with the attention of a scientist observing a particularly interesting phenomenon. The elaborate rituals of rank and deference, the energy spent on reputation, the complex social choreography of who was seated where and spoken to when and acknowledged by what means. He saw beneath all the ceremony the same thing he saw in every other form of diversion, the avoidance of the quiet room. Because a courtier who was alone, genuinely, completely alone, without even the performance of being someone important, was a courtier confronting a question he could not answer with ceremony. Who am I beneath the rank? And that question, in an era built entirely on rank, was essentially unanswerable through the available means. We do not have courtiers in most of our lives, but we have something remarkably similar. The professional identity, the social media presence, the community status, the reputation for competence or humor or reliability or success that we maintain through 1,000 small daily calibrations. None of this is dishonest exactly, but all of it is partial. All of it is a selection from the full picture of what we actually are. And here is the small truth that costs something to admit. The energy we spend maintaining those selections is enormous. More enormous often than we allow ourselves to recognize. The constant low-level monitoring of how we are being perceived. The retrospective review of what we said and whether it landed well. The preemptive management of how tomorrow's interaction will go. This is the theater of vanity. Not in the simple sense of caring too much about appearance, in the deeper sense that Pascal meant. The theater that keeps us so occupied with the performance of being someone that we never quite have time to be that someone. The person behind the performance is not inferior to the performance. Usually, they are more interesting, more honest, more real. But the performance, once established, takes on a life of its own. It requires maintenance. It requires audience. And it provides, in the currency of social recognition, a kind of temporary answer to the deeper question of worth. Not a satisfying answer, but a distracting one. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from a life organized primarily around performance. Not the exhaustion of hard work. Hard work exhausts the body and leaves the mind clear. This is something else. The exhaustion of the person who has spent so long presenting the right version of themselves that they can no longer quite find the version that came before the right one. Who has maintained the performance through so many contexts and years that the performance has become their primary relationship with themselves. Some people arrive at midlife with this exhaustion and do not know how to name it. They have been successful by most measures. They have the reputation they worked for, the competence they built, the recognition they earned. And yet something is tired in a way that accomplishment cannot address. Pascal would have known immediately what was tired. Not the self, the performance of the self, the part that was never the real thing. And the real thing, quieter, slower, less certain of its lines, has been waiting patiently behind the curtain. It is waiting in this room. Let your face relax now. The muscles around the eyes, the jaw. There is no one watching in this room. And in that absence of watching, something can be here that cannot be when you are performing. Just you, unobserved. Without the calibration, without the selection. Just this. It is smaller than the performance in some ways, and enormously larger in others. Chapter 14. Why we need applause. There is a hunger most of us never fully admit to, not for food or comfort or security. Those hungers are socially acceptable. This one is quieter and harder to name. It is the hunger to matter, to be seen, to have our existence acknowledged by another person in a way that confirms, yes, you are here, and your being here is not nothing. Pascal understood this hunger with characteristic precision. He wrote about the way humans seek the opinion of others as if it were a form of sustenance. We think constantly about what others think of us. We structure our days, our choices, our self-presentation around the implied gaze of people who are usually not even watching. He called this one of the most revealing things about human nature. Not revealing in a shameful way, revealing in the sense of showing us something true about our construction. Because the hunger for recognition is not, at its root, vanity. It is loneliness. The self that has not been seen by another self is not fully real to itself. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is something every person who has ever moved through an extended stretch without genuine connection has felt. The way the days begin to blur, the way your own thoughts become harder to trust, The way you begin to wonder, in the absence of reflection, whether anything you feel or do actually counts. We are social creatures who need the mirror of another person to stay oriented. The applause, in whatever form it takes, from literal praise to simple acknowledgement to the notification on a phone, is the external confirmation that we are here. Pascal would say, this is not weakness. This is the other side of our grandeur. The creature who needs to be seen is the creature capable of genuinely seeing. The capacity for recognition runs in both directions. And a person who is entirely indifferent to the opinion of others is not liberated. They have simply withdrawn from the most specifically human of encounters. But, and this is the important part, when the need for recognition becomes the primary organizer of a life, something shifts. The self begins to live outside itself, in the eyes of others, in the reaction of the crowd, in the metrics of approval. And the self that lives outside itself has no interior to return to when the crowd is gone. This is the problem Pascal saw in the courts and salons of his era. Men of genuine intelligence and capacity who had so thoroughly organized themselves around the opinion of others that they could not sit quietly with themselves for an afternoon. The applause had become the only silence they could stand. And when the applause stopped, when the day ended and the performance was over and the empty room arrived, they reached desperately for more diversion, more entertainment, more activity, more anything except the quiet in which they would have to be simply themselves. Modern psychology has confirmed something in the vicinity of what Pascal intuited. Researchers who study intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation have found consistently that people whose sense of worth is organized primarily around external feedback, around approval and recognition and the opinions of others, experience a particular kind of fragility. Not weakness of character, but fragility of foundation. Because external foundations shift. The approval that arrives today does not guarantee tomorrow's approval. And a self that lives in the gaps between others' recognition spends an enormous amount of energy in a kind of permanent audition. The applause is not the problem. We all need it sometimes. It becomes the problem only when we cannot rest without it. And rest, genuine rest, the kind that Pascal spent his life trying to understand, requires exactly that. The ability to be here, in the quiet room, without the confirmation of anyone's watching, to be here and to be enough, just as you are. In this room, tonight, Chapter 15, Solitude and Self-Recognition. There is a difference between being alone and being in solitude. Many people spend enormous amounts of time alone without ever arriving at solitude. They sit by themselves and scroll through other people's lives. They drive in silence but fill the silence with voices from a speaker. They eat alone but with a screen for company. They are physically alone but not really alone. They have imported the world into the room and kept it buzzing around them like furniture. Solitude is something different. Solitude is the willingness to be present in the quiet without filling it. To sit with your own company, the actual texture of your own thoughts, your own breath, your own awareness, without immediately reaching for something to add. Pascal believed solitude, in this genuine sense, was not a privilege of monks and hermits. It was a necessity for anyone who wanted to understand what they actually were, not what they were performing, not what they were achieving, not what others had decided about them, what they actually were. He had observed in the trajectory of his own life that the periods of forced stillness, the stretches of illness when he could not work, could not engage, could only lie in a quiet room and be present with himself, were the periods of his most important understanding. Not his most brilliant mathematics, not his most devastating polemics, his most honest understanding. Something is different about a person who has sat with themselves long enough to stop performing, even for their own internal audience. The self has an internal audience too, a version of ourselves we put on for our own observation, the narrative of who we are and what we have been and what our choices have meant. This internal performance is often the most demanding one because the internal audience knows the parts we left out of the public version. Genuine solitude eventually strips that too. It is not comfortable. Most people who try it for the first time feel, after a short while, a rising discomfort that they interpret as failure. The mind reaches, the body fidgets. Something insists that this is a waste of time. That insistence is not truth. It is the performance mechanism trying to reassert itself. If you stay, if you do not fill the quiet, the discomfort generally passes. Not all at once, in waves. And in the space after a wave, something else arrives. Montaigne, the French essayist who lived a century before Pascal, described his own experiment with solitude in his famous Tower Library. He had retired from public life at 38, following losses that had hollowed him out. A beloved friend, his father, his first child. He retreated to a round room full of books, and instead of writing about the world, he began writing about himself. He invented the personal essay in that room, and what he found in the process was a self he had not previously encountered. Richer, stranger, more contradictory, more interesting than the public man he had been performing for decades. He wrote, "Each person contains a complete world." Pascal would have agreed, but he would have added, "A world you can only reach through honest stillness." Solitude is not the absence of the world. It is the presence of the one you have been too busy to meet. And that interior world, the one that solitude makes available, is not simply a reflection of your difficulties or your anxieties. It contains those things, yes, but it also contains something that the busy performance of daily life tends to obscure: warmth, curiosity, an interest in small things that the pace of the ordinary week does not leave room for. The particular quality of your own humor, the way your thoughts move when they are not organized around a task, the images that surface when the image-producing mechanisms of the world are not competing for the same space. People who have spent genuine time in solitude often discover that the interior self is more interesting than expected. Not more virtuous, not more enlightened, just more themselves, in the fullest, least edited sense, more capable of being moved by ordinary things, more honest about what they actually feel versus what they have agreed to feel. Montaigne, writing in his tower, described discovering things about himself that decades of public life had successfully hidden. Not shameful things, just real ones. Preferences he had never acknowledged, fears he had never named. A capacity for wonder that the efficient person he performed at work had no use for. He wrote, "Each person contains a complete world." Pascal would have agreed. But he would have added, "A world you can only reach through honest stillness." Let your awareness settle inward for a moment, not to examine, not to evaluate, just to be present with whatever is actually here. The breath, the weight of the body. The quality of your thoughts at this hour, that is the world Pascal was talking about. It has been waiting. Chapter 16. Silence before the self. You may remember the two kinds of silence mentioned at the Senf, beginning of tonight. One we run from, one we have forgotten how to find. We have spent some time now with the first kind, the silence that makes us uncomfortable. The silence that sends us reaching for our phones and filling our evenings and keeping some noise running in the background. The silence that reveals things we would rather not see. Now we can begin to talk about the second kind. Pascal described it not as the absence of sound, but as the presence of something. A quality of attention that is, in his words, closer to truth than any noise can be. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that is full of what is real. He arrived at this second kind of silence through the first, not around it. That is the path he described, and it is the same path available to any of us. It tends to arrive quietly, without announcement. It is not the product of effort. In fact, effort tends to prevent it. It is more like what happens when you stop rowing and the boat continues moving on its own momentum. A carryover from the willingness to be still, arriving after the willingness rather than within it. People who have experienced it describe something similar, a settling, not of the world around them. The world stays exactly as it was, a settling of the relationship between themselves and the world, a small but real shift from being inside the noise to being aware of the noise, from being the restlessness to simply noticing the restlessness. That shift is the second silence. It does not last long. At first, the noise reasserts itself. The management and the calibration and the reaching resume their authority. But the shift has happened. And having happened once, it becomes slightly easier to find the next time and the next. Not because you have mastered anything, because you have recognized something. The difference between living in the clouds and knowing that the sky is behind them, you cannot reach the second silence by avoiding the first. You cannot reach the second silence by avoiding the first. You cannot find genuine stillness by filling every uncomfortable moment with noise and then expecting peace to arrive one day as a gift. The peace is on the other side of the discomfort. The second silence is through the door of the first. This is why Pascal's philosophy, for all its apparent pessimism about human nature, is ultimately hopeful. He is not saying that we are doomed to restlessness. He is saying that restlessness has a direction, that the ache we feel in the quiet is not proof of emptiness, but proof of depth. And that the depth, if we are willing to go into it, contains something we have been looking for longer than we might be willing to admit. There is a quietness that arrives on the other side of the familiar noise. It is not the dramatic silence of a monastery or a mountaintop, though those places can help reach it. It is available in an ordinary room, at an ordinary hour, to an ordinary person who has simply decided to stop moving for long enough to notice what is here when the motion stops. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk who spent decades teaching mindfulness to people in some of the most chaotic circumstances imaginable, described this second silence as the ground beneath the noise. He wrote of feelings coming and going like clouds in a windy sky, and of the sky itself remaining steady behind them. The sky is the second silence. The clouds are the diversions. Most of us live in the clouds. We identify with them so completely that we have forgotten there is sky behind them. Pascal would say, the sky was always there. You were just too busy looking at the clouds. And the sky, the second silence, the quiet that is not empty but full, is where something honest lives. Something that cannot be distracted or performed or optimized. Just the self, before it became a project, before it became a reputation, before it became a schedule. The self in the silence before the self. Notice this moment. Not what you should be doing, not what you meant to do earlier, not what tomorrow requires. Just this moment, this room, this breath. This is the second silence. You have already arrived. Chapter 17, The Body Craves Motion. The restlessness Pascal described is not only in the mind, it lives in the body too. In the hands that reach for something to hold. In the legs that bounce slightly under the desk during long meetings. In the eyes that scan the room when the conversation goes quiet. In the shallow breath that never quite finishes its cycle. We tend to think of the philosopher's problem, the restlessness, the diversion, the flight from silence, as a mental phenomenon. But the body is not separate from the mind in this. The body learned the same habits of avoidance, and it practices them independently, often before the mind is even aware of what is happening. Bessel van der Kolk, the psychiatrist and trauma researcher, spent decades documenting something that Pascal intuited with his characteristic honesty, that the body keeps its own record, not just of trauma and crisis, but of habitual states, of patterns repeated across thousands of ordinary days, of the chronic low-level vigilance that becomes the body's default setting when stillness has long been associated with discomfort. The body that has learned to stay in motion does not stop moving simply because the person decides to rest. It has been trained. Its chemistry has been shaped by years of the association. Movement equals safety. Stillness equals the uncomfortable thing. This is why, when you lie down to sleep, you may feel the body resist. Not because it is not physically tired, often it is exhausted, but because the nervous system has not received the signal that stillness is safe. The signal it has been receiving for years is the opposite. There is nothing simple about retraining this, but there is something useful in simply naming it. Because what is named is no longer entirely mysterious, and what is no longer mysterious is no longer entirely threatening. Pascal did not have the vocabulary of neuroscience, but he understood from the inside what it felt like to have a body that would not cooperate with stillness. He was in pain for much of his adult life. His body was frequently working against him. And in those stretches of enforced rest, he discovered something that van der Kolk's research would later support from a very different angle. The body can learn a new relationship with stillness, but it requires time and gentleness, not force. You cannot fight your way into relaxation. The effort of fighting is itself a form of motion, which activates the exact mechanism you are trying to quiet. What works is something closer to permission. There is a version of this that some people recognize from the end of a very long day. Not the usual kind of tired, where the body aches from physical effort. This is the tired that arrives after years of vigilance. A deeper kind. The kind where the body finally, quietly, stops pretending it is fine. It often happens unexpectedly. Not when you plan for it, but when you are somewhere quiet and something lowers without your instruction. The shoulders descend. The breath becomes fuller without any decision to make it so. And for a moment, a few minutes, sometimes more, the vigilance lifts. The body, in that moment, is not simply resting. It is remembering something it knew before the years of constant readiness taught it to forget. That rest is a biological fact, not a character achievement. The body was built for it. It returns to it given the chance, given the signal that the chance is actually here. That signal is not complicated. It is exactly what this hour is. The voice, the quiet, the absence of anything that requires a response. giving the body, explicitly, kindly, the way you would give permission to a nervous animal, the signal that it is safe to be still, that the vigilance can ease, that nothing is being missed, that the monitoring can rest. Feel your body now in whatever position it has found. Notice where it is holding unnecessarily. The shoulders that have crept toward the ears. The hands that are slightly curled. The jaw that has a degree of tension that serves no present purpose. Just notice. Then, with the lightest possible intention, let that place soften, not because something needs to be fixed, but because the body, when given explicit permission, often knows exactly what to do. It was built for rest. It just needed to be reminded that rest was allowed. Chapter 18, Dopamine and Diversion, Pascal wrote about the king and the hunt. He described how a king, powerful, wealthy, with every comfort available to him, would nonetheless spend days in the cold and mud of a hunt, pursuing an animal he did not particularly need, driven by an appetite for the chase that had nothing to do with hunger. And he observed, with his characteristic precision, that if you offered the king the animal already caught, already delivered to his table, with all the effort of the hunt removed, the king would be far less interested, perhaps completely uninterested. It was never about the animal, it was about the motion. 3 centuries later, behavioral neuroscience arrived at almost exactly the same conclusion through a different door. The neurotransmitter dopamine, it turns out, is not primarily a reward chemical. It is an anticipation chemical. It fires most powerfully not when you receive something pleasurable, but when you expect to. When the outcome is uncertain, when the next thing might be satisfying or might not be, the dopamine system maintains a state of alert engagement that is, in its own way, a kind of pleasure. The scroll works, not because what you find is consistently interesting. It works because the next thing might be. The dopamine keeps the motion going in the uncertainty between stimulus and stimulus. Pascal's king was feeling his dopamine. The hunt was not a failure of willpower or a sign of frivolous character. It was the nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are optimized to do: maintain engagement with the environment by keeping the question of what is next perpetually open. The problem, as Pascal saw it, is that this optimization was never designed with happiness in mind. It was designed with survival in mind. A brain that stays alert and engaged with the environment is more likely to survive than one that settles into comfortable stillness. But survival and happiness are not the same project, and a system optimized for one is not automatically suited for the other. This is the deeper irony at the center of the modern condition. We have built an entire civilization of dopamine triggers. Entertainment designed by very smart people to keep the question of what is next perpetually open. News cycles that replace one piece of alarming information with another before the first can be processed. Notification systems that deliver variable rewards at intervals calibrated to maximize re-engagement. We are not undisciplined for finding this difficult to escape. We are human, encountering a system specifically engineered to colonize exactly the mechanisms Pascal was describing in 1670. The buried confession in Pascal's papers is not that humans are weak, it is that the hunger for diversion is structural, that it is written into the operating system, that it is not a character flaw to be corrected through willpower alone. It is a condition to be understood. And understanding it, really understanding it, not just knowing it intellectually, but feeling the recognition of it, is itself a kind of relief, because the person who understands the mechanism is no longer at its mercy in the same way, not free of it, not above it, but related to it differently. The next time the reach begins, the hand moving toward the screen, the mind moving toward the next distraction, you can notice the reach itself. Observe it with the curiosity of someone watching an interesting phenomenon. And in that fraction of a second of observation, something small but real becomes possible. A choice, not always taken, but always available. And available is enough. Chapter 19. Kings, hunters, and games. Pascal watched the powerful people of his world with the attention of a naturalist. He was not part of the court. He moved at its edges, brilliant enough to be received, principled enough to remain skeptical. And from that edge, he observed what the exercise of power did to people over time. He noticed that kings, surrounded by flattery, cushioned from consequence, insulated from the ordinary friction of life that most people navigate daily, were not noticeably happier than their subjects. In some ways, they were more restless, more dependent on the provision of entertainment, more easily bored, more agitated when left without ceremony or spectacle. He thought he understood why. The ordinary person, Pascal observed, has a relationship with reality that the king lacks. The necessity of work, of struggle, of genuine consequence, these are, for all their discomfort, deeply engaging. They provide what Pascal called real occupation, the kind that absorbs the self in something genuinely demanding, genuinely uncertain, genuinely mattering. The king, cushioned from all of that, has no real occupation, only performed occupation. The hunt is not hunting, it is hunting-shaped diversion. The game is not really a game, it is game-shaped diversion. The ceremony is not real ceremony, it is ceremony-shaped diversion. Everything has been drained of genuine stakes and replaced with the simulation of stakes. And the self, which can tell the difference even when the mind is not paying attention, becomes restless in a very particular way. The way a person becomes restless in a conversation that has the appearance of depth but no actual depth, a formless dissatisfaction that they cannot locate but cannot escape. We live in an age that has made most of us kings in this particular sense. not in wealth or power, but in our relationship to simulation. The games we play are not real games. The outcome does not affect our actual lives. The stories we consume are not our stories, they are other people's fabricated experiences delivered to us with all the uncertainty removed. The arguments we follow are not our arguments. They are performances of conflict that resolve nothing in our actual world. We consume diversion at a scale that would have astonished Pascal, and we are restless in exactly the way he predicted. Not because we are ungrateful, not because we have too much, but because the human self is designed for genuine encounter with something real, something that matters, that resists, that demands something genuine in return, and simulation, for all its comfort, cannot provide that encounter. It can only postpone the encounter while maintaining the nervous system in a permanent, low-grade state of almost satisfied, almost engaged, almost at rest, never quite. There is a specific relief that comes from genuine occupation, from being fully absorbed in something real. A conversation that requires your actual attention. A problem that requires your actual thinking. A relationship that requires your actual presence. The relief is not just pleasure. It is the relief of the self meeting itself in genuine circumstances. This is why so many people report that their busiest, most genuinely demanding periods are not their unhappiest. The self, met with real stakes, stops needing diversion. It is already fully present. The trouble comes in the aftermath, when the genuine occupation ends. When the stakes are met, and the crisis has passed, and the ordinary day returns, and the quiet room is there again, waiting, with the same patience it always had. Let your breath be easy now. There is nothing to perform in this room tonight. Nothing to simulate. No game to maintain. Just the genuine texture of this moment. It is more than enough. Chapter 20. The Tragedy of Entertainment. There is a sadness in the person who has just finished the last episode. Not the sadness of the story ending. The characters' stories will be fine. They were always fictional, and fictional things do not suffer. The sadness is something else. It is the sadness of the evening, now needing to be something without a purpose. The ending of the show is the ending of the provided direction. And without the direction, the question returns, what now? Pascal would not have been surprised. He wrote about entertainment with a kind of compassion that his critics sometimes missed, reading him as a Puritan demanding that people give up pleasure. He was not demanding that. He was observing something about what entertainment actually does and does not provide. Entertainment occupies. That is its gift. For the duration of the occupation, the self is directed outward, toward the story, the game, the spectacle. The questions that wait in the quiet room are, for that duration, genuinely held at bay. This is not nothing. Genuine respite is valuable. The mind that has been occupied by a good story is often, afterward, more capable of genuine rest than the mind that has been circling its own anxieties for the same duration. But entertainment has a structural limitation. It ends. And it ends in a particular way. Not by resolving the questions that preceded it. Those questions are still there, unchanged, in the position they were in when the entertainment began. It ends by creating a small additional problem. The transition back to the unoccupied self now requires an additional step. The step of remembering that this is where you actually live, not in the world of the story, not in the compressed drama of structured entertainment, here, in the ordinary room, with the ordinary questions, with the same self that was here before the show began. Entertainment cannot change what it finds. It can only temporarily redirect the attention away from it. And here is the quiet tragedy Pascal identified. The person who relies primarily on entertainment for relief from the discomfort of self-encounter will require increasingly consistent doses of it. Because the self does not change between episodes. It simply waits, and when it is encountered again after a season of avoidance, the encounter is no easier than it would have been without the avoidance. Often it is harder, because the habit of redirection has become stronger. The tolerance for the quiet room has been further reduced. The tragedy is not the entertainment itself. The tragedy is the slow, unintended replacement. Entertainment taking the place of encounter until encounter becomes almost impossible without it. Pascal watched this happening in the sophisticated, educated, privileged world of his era. People who had every resource available to them for genuine self-understanding and who were using those resources entirely for self-avoidance. Not out of laziness, out of fear, and out of a cultural apparatus that provided at every turn something else to look at. The good news is that this is reversible, not through effort or discipline in the willpower sense, through something gentler, the gradual rebuilding of a relationship with the quiet room, the slow relearning that the self waiting in the silence is not an enemy, that it is, in fact, the most interesting thing available. Notice the room around you now, the actual room, not the room of the story you were just in, or the room your mind builds when it runs ahead to tomorrow. This room, this hour, this self, there is no ending to navigate here. No transition to manage, just presence. That is the entertainment Pascal was always pointing toward. The only one that does not end when you close your eyes. Chapter 21, Misery Without Meaning. There is a kind of suffering that has a purpose and a kind of suffering that does not. Pascal knew the difference intimately. He had experienced both. The suffering with purpose is not painless, but it has a direction. Something is being built through it, or something is being learned. or something is being honored in the enduring of it. The person in this suffering may not be happy, but they are not hollow. They are oriented. The suffering without purpose is different. It is the suffering that arrives when there is no coherent story to place it in. When the pain is just pain, the loss is just loss, and the question of what it means arrives and finds no answer waiting. Pascal called this the human condition stripped of its diversions and its narratives. Misery. Not as a permanent state, but as the raw material of human experience, before meaning is applied to it. He was not a pessimist. This is important to understand. He was a diagnostician. He was naming the experience, not prescribing it as the final word. He believed that most of what we call unhappiness is not simply the presence of pain, it is the experience of pain without meaning. The same event, a loss, a disappointment, a failure, can be experienced entirely differently, depending on whether the person experiencing it has a frame that makes sense of it. Viktor Frankl, writing from the concentration camps that represent perhaps the most extreme test case of this principle, observed exactly the same thing. He saw people survive experiences of unimaginable suffering, not because they were stronger or more resilient in any physical sense, but because they had found or were able to construct a meaning for what was happening to them. He wrote about imagining himself in a warm lecture hall years later, teaching what this suffering had taught him. He survived. And then he did exactly that. The meaning did not remove the pain. It transformed the relationship to the pain. Pascal understood this, though he framed it through a different lens than Frankl would. He believed that the misery of the human condition is not the enemy of meaning. It is, in a strange way, the very thing that makes meaning possible. A creature who never suffered would not need meaning. A creature who never encountered the gap between what it longed for and what it had would never develop the capacity to reach across that gap through story, through love, through faith, through art. The misery is the pressure that produces the reaching and the reaching towards something beyond the available comfort, beyond the adequate explanation, beyond the present moment, is what makes a human life specifically human. This does not make the suffering pleasant. Pascal was not that kind of philosopher, but it makes the suffering legible, and legible things can be lived with in a way that illegible things cannot. There is something in your life right now that is simply hard. Not dramatically, not in a way that makes a good story yet, just quietly, persistently hard. The kind of hard that does not announce itself but that colors the ordinary days. You do not have to have it figured out tonight, but it may help just slightly to know that Pascal, who carried enormous physical pain, enormous grief, enormous doubt, believed that the hard thing was not pointless, that the misery faced honestly was the beginning of something, not the end. Let your body be heavy now. Let the weight be there. It does not have to be light to be real. It does not have to be resolved to be held. It just has to be honest. And honest, you already are. Chapter 22. The Infinite Within Us. Pascal wrote about infinity the way a person writes about something they have actually encountered. Not as a philosophical concept, not as a mathematical abstraction, as a felt reality, an experience of the self that could not be contained in any finite description. He had 2 such encounters that he documented. The first was through mathematics and physics. He worked on probability theory, on the mathematics of infinite series, on the behavior of infinitely small quantities. He was one of the early thinkers to handle the infinite rigorously, to treat it as something that could be reasoned about rather than simply gestured at. And in that work, he encountered something that never quite left him: the recognition that the human mind could conceive of the infinite, could handle it, reason about it, calculate with it, while living in a body that could be undone by a change in the weather. The gap between the scale of what we could imagine and the scale of what we were is not small. It is enormous. The second encounter was experiential. His night of fire, that November evening in 1654, when something beyond his capacity to describe arrived in his room and would not leave. He tried to write it down. What he produced was not philosophy. It was shaking. It was fire. It was presence at a scale that made his mathematics feel like a footnote. He sewed the record of it into his coat. Both encounters pointed at the same thing. Something in the human person is not adequately described by the physical dimensions of the human person. You are larger than you appear. Not in the way that self-help means when it says you are larger than you appear. Not larger in terms of potential or capability or what you could achieve if you applied yourself. Larger in the sense of containing a scale of awareness, of longing, of love, of grief, of wonder that no finite thing can satisfy. This is the infinite within you. It is the thing that makes a beautiful piece of music affect you in a way that a pleasant arrangement of sound should not. It is the thing that makes the birth of a child feel like more than biology. It is the thing that makes the death of someone you love feel like a tear in the fabric of the world, not just a statistical event. These responses are not irrational. They are precisely rational. The rational responses of a being capable of perceiving the infinite to encounters that touch the edge of it. Pascal believed this was not an accident of evolution or an anthropological curiosity. He believed the infinite within us was a sign, a signature, an indication of the scale of what we were made for, regardless of whether we were reaching it. You do not have to share his theology to feel the truth of what he was pointing at. You have felt it. In the moments that felt too big for their physical dimensions, in the love that would not reduce to anything explicable, in the grief that felt like it contained the weight of every related grief you had ever held. In the moment, at the edge of something beautiful, when you knew, briefly and completely, that you were in the presence of something that mattered in ways you could not name. That feeling is the infinite within you. Recognizing it, let your breath be slow and easy now. You contain more than your dimensions suggest. More than the ordinary days reveal. More than any summary of your biography could hold. The infinite is patient. It does not demand recognition tonight. It is simply here, as it always has been. Chapter 23. Greatness and Fragility. Man is a reed, Pascal wrote. The most feeble thing in nature. A single branch growing at the edge of moving water. Thin, hollow, easily broken. A storm does not even need to try to end it. But he is a thinking reed. And this changes everything, because the universe that destroys him does not know what it is doing. The flood does not understand that it is destroying something irreplaceable. The disease does not know it is extinguishing something that had the capacity to love and grieve and wonder. The vastness of space and time that dwarfs us does not perceive us at all, but we perceive it. We contain it in a way, not physically. Physically, we are nothing against the scale of what is, but in consciousness, in awareness, in the capacity to comprehend the size of what surrounds us, we are larger than what surrounds us in the one dimension that matters. A galaxy cannot know it is magnificent. You can. And knowing that you are small is, paradoxically, the most magnificent thing about you. This was Pascal's unexpected turn. Having established the fragility and wretchedness of the human condition, having named the restlessness and the diversion and the gap between what we long for and what we can hold, he arrived not at despair, but at something close to awe. He was in awe of the creature that was capable of seeing its own smallness. Because seeing your own smallness is not what small things do. Small things do not have the perspective to perceive their scale. The capacity to say, I am finite, I am mortal, I am brief and contingent, and far less than I wish I were. That capacity is itself a kind of transcendence. The person who can hold the full, honest picture of what they are, the beauty and the limitation, the love and the fear, the hunger for the infinite and the reality of the finite, has achieved something the rest of the universe, as far as we can tell, has not achieved. Genuine self-knowledge. Not comfortable self-knowledge, the kind that includes the parts that are hard to include, the years that were not what you hoped they would be, the choices that you would make differently, the distances between yourself and the people you love, the fact that time is not unlimited. All of this held at once, without either flinching from it or being destroyed by it. There is a specific kind of person who has developed this capacity. Not the person who has achieved the most or suffered the most necessarily. The person who has been present for their own experience, who has not managed it entirely away or numbed it entirely down or organized it entirely into a story that is more comfortable than true, they can be found in ordinary places. Sitting quietly at a table while others move around them, walking without earbuds in, present in a conversation in a way that makes the other person feel, without quite knowing why, that what they are saying is genuinely being heard. These people are not specially enlightened. They have simply been willing more than once to sit in the room without escape and let the mirror show them what is actually there. Pascal would have called them the thinking reeds who have accepted their nature, who have looked at the fragility and the greatness together without requiring either to be more than it is. That is what Pascal was writing toward, in all those fragments, in all those cold rooms, in all those evenings of genuine encounter with what he actually was. You have more years behind you than most people who have ever lived, ever had. You have accumulated something that the young do not yet have access to. The knowledge of what loss feels like from the inside, of what love costs, of what regret teaches, of what survival actually means when you have survived enough things to have data on the subject. That knowledge is not simply weight, it is the weight of a thinking reed who has thought and felt and chosen and continued, who has been fragile and has not dissolved, who has been small and has known it and has kept going anyway. Let your breath be easy. Let the weight of those years rest for a moment instead of carrying itself. You are fragile, yes. Every human being is. But you are also here. And being here, aware of your own finitude, in the dark, still listening, that is exactly what Pascal was describing when he used the word greatness. Just this. You. Chapter 24, The Heart Has Reasons. There is a knowledge that arrives before the argument. Does. Pascal described it as the knowledge of the heart, not emotion in the sentimental sense, not the knowledge of what you want to feel or what you hope is true. The knowledge that is felt in the body before it is assembled in the mind, the recognition that does not wait for evidence. He wrote that the heart has its reasons that reason does not know, and he meant this precisely, not as a license for wishful thinking, not as permission to believe whatever feels comfortable. He meant that there is a mode of knowing that is not reducible to logical argument, that operates at a different speed and through different channels, and arrives at truths that the formal reasoning mind would take years to work out, if it arrived at them at all. We experience this daily, though we do not always name it. The moment in a conversation when you know, without being able to say how you know, that something important is being said beneath what is actually being said. The recognition of a person's pain before they have explained it. The certainty that a particular decision is wrong before you have identified which reason makes it wrong. Scientists call this intuition. Researchers like Gary Klein, who study expert decision-making, have found that experienced practitioners, surgeons, firefighters, chess grandmasters, make some of their best decisions not through deliberate analysis, but through something that looks more like feeling. A rapid, holistic processing of pattern and context that produces a verdict before the conscious mind has even framed the question. The experts themselves often cannot explain their best decisions. They know what to do before they know why. Pascal believed this was not a limitation to be corrected. It was a faculty to be recognized. And he believed the heart's reasons were, in certain domains, more reliable than the mind's arguments. Not in mathematics, not in physics, but in the domains that matter most to most people most of the time: love, meaning, the orientation of a life, the understanding of what is real. This matters for how we understand our own restlessness, because some of what we carry in the quiet room, some of what surfaces when the diversions fall away, is not a problem to see. Be solved by better thinking. It is the heart's knowledge of something that the mind has not yet caught up to, a relationship that is no longer what it was, a direction that has quietly become the wrong one, a hunger that the current arrangements of life are not feeding. The heart knows these things before the mind is willing to name them, and the discomfort of the quiet room is often the heart trying to get the mind's attention, not to alarm, not to catastrophize, just to say there is something here worth knowing, something real, something the noise has been successfully keeping out of the conversation. The nighttime mind that will not quiet is often the mind that has finally gotten close enough to the heart's knowledge to begin to hear it, and hearing it genuinely, without immediately arguing with it or dismissing it or rushing to fix it, is itself a form of rest. The kind of rest that comes from finally letting something be real. There is a person who spent several months with a senbaka, quiet discomfort she could not name, not depression, not anxiety in any clinical sense, just an undertow, something pulling slightly against the current of her days. She was busy enough to ignore it most of the time, but at night, in the gap before sleep, it was there. She eventually gave herself the uncomfortable gift of sitting with it for a full hour. No phone, no distraction, just the undertow and her honest attention. What surfaced was not dramatic. A friendship she had been maintaining out of obligation rather than genuine warmth. A creative project she had quietly abandoned 2 years ago and had never officially mourned. A conversation she owed to someone she was avoiding. None of these were emergencies, but all of them were real. And the undertow, she realized, had been carrying each of them, trying patiently to get her attention long enough to hand them over. The heart had known all of this long before the mind was willing to admit it. Pascal wrote about exactly this. He called the heart's knowledge a form of illumination that the rational mind, with all its instruments, could not replicate. Not because the mind was inferior, because the heart was operating in a different register, faster, less organized, but closer to the actual truth of things. Feel what is present for you right now, not what you should be feeling. What is actually here? The heart already knows. You are simply beginning to listen. Chapter 25. Reason meets the night. There is a version of yourself that appears at night that does not appear during the day. Not a worse version necessarily, often not the worst, but a version that is less managed, less curated, less defended by the rational apparatus that keeps the day organized and functional. This nighttime self thinks in images more than arguments. It loops rather than concludes. It makes connections the daytime mind would dismiss as too associative, too emotional, too large. It feels things at a scale that the daylight hours would find inconvenient, and it is, in some ways, more honest. Pascal would have recognized the nighttime self immediately. He would have said, "That is the self that diversion has not yet reached." The self that the daytime occupation of argument and experiment and social performance has not yet organized into something presentable. He would not have said, "That self is the problem." He would have said that self is the text, and the daytime self is the translation. Translations are useful. We need them to function in the world, to communicate, to build the practical architecture of a life. But they are always partial. Something is always lost in the translation from felt experience to organized thought. The nighttime self is closer to the original. This is why the questions that arrive at night feel so large and so difficult to manage. Not because they are larger than the daytime questions, but because the translation has not yet reduced them to a manageable size. The grief that comes in the night is fuller than the grief that can be expressed during the day. The longing is more specific. The fear is less filtered. The love is less self-conscious. All of this is information, not a diagnosis, not an emergency. Information. The Stoics had a practice they called the evening review. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it in his journal. The practice of examining each day before sleep with honest attention. Not to beat himself up, not to perform virtue, just to see what had actually happened, separate from how he had presented it to others and to himself. Seneca practiced a version of it too. He described sitting with each evening and asking 3 simple questions. Where did I fail? Where did I improve? What was better today than yesterday? The practice was not about guilt or self-improvement in the optimizing sense. It was about staying in genuine contact with the actual texture of a life rather than the edited version. The nighttime self, with its unfiltered questions and its large feelings and its refusal to be convinced by the reasonable arguments, is performing its own version of the evening review, uninvited, unstructured, but serving the same function, bringing you into contact with what is actually there. The rational mind that tries to argue the nighttime self into submission, that builds counter-arguments to the feelings, that calls the thoughts irrational and tries to dismiss them on technical grounds, is usually not more effective than the nighttime self. It is just more exhausting. What is more effective, Pascal would say, is the opposite of argument. Listening, not to agree, not to be overwhelmed, just to genuinely hear what the heart is raising, with the tolerance of someone who trusts that what is real deserves to be heard before it is handled. You do not have to resolve tonight's nighttime self. You do not have to make sense of everything it is surfacing, but you can listen, and in the listening, something strange happens. The nighttime self, heard, tends to calm. Not because the problems are solved, because they have been acknowledged. And acknowledgement, the simple, honest recognition of what is real, is, in its own way, a form of rest. Let the night be honest tonight. You are safe enough to hear it. Chapter 26. The need to kneel. Pascal came, at the end of his short life, to a position that his critics found embarrassing. This brilliant, rigorous, contrarian man, the person who dismantled the Jesuits in print and proved the vacuum with his own experiments, and invented machines that could calculate faster than human minds, arrived in his final years at something that looked very much like submission, not to a social authority, not to a worldly power, to something he could not prove and could not argue his way to and could not contain in any of his very considerable intellectual systems. He wrote that faith, for him, was not the conclusion of an argument. It was the act of a person who had exhausted the argument and found something on the other side of it. He wrote about kneeling, not as a metaphor, as an actual practice. He wrote that the person who kneels in the dark, without certainty, without proof, in the act of surrender itself, sometimes finds something that the upright, argumentative, fully defended posture never reaches. His famous wager is often taught as a logical argument. If God exists and you believe, you gain everything. If God does not exist and you believe, you lose nothing. Therefore, belief is the rational bet. And it is, as arguments go, clever. But Pascal himself knew the argument was not the point. The wager was not designed to convince the intellect. It was designed to move the person, to introduce the possibility of orientation, of deciding without certainty that a particular direction was worth moving in. Because Pascal had found that certainty was not available, not in theology, not in science really, if you pressed far enough, not in any domain where the questions were large enough to matter to an actual human life. What was available was orientation, a direction, a willingness to move towards something with open hands without requiring that the destination be proven before you began walking. You may not share Pascal's faith. Most people today do not organize their lives around the specific theology he devoted his final years to. That is not the point of what we are doing tonight. The point is the posture of kneeling, of genuine surrender, of releasing the need to control the outcome through argument and performance, and the maintenance of perfect self-sufficiency is available to anyone in any direction, toward any genuine value, toward beauty, toward love, toward the relationship that deserves more of you than you have been giving, toward the life that is asking something of you that you have been too defended to hear. The need to kneel is not weakness. It is the recognition that the upright, defended, self-sufficient posture is exhausting in a way that no amount of diversion can repair. Think of the specific kind of tiredness that comes from always having to know, always having to be right, always being the person in the room who has the answer, the plan, the explanation, the composure. It is a real tiredness. Not the tiredness of hard work, but the tiredness of the person who cannot afford to stop performing. Pascal was that person for most of his life, the sharpest mind in the room, the one who could dismantle arguments before others had finished making them. The one who saw the flaws in, received wisdom before anyone else had noticed the wisdom was received. And then illness slowed him, and grief came, and the room grew quiet in ways that his intellect could not fill. And in that quiet, he found that something he had been defending against, something he had been too upright and too armored to allow, was actually what he had been looking for, not the certainty he had tried to build through argument. Something much simpler than certainty: presence. The bare, honest, undefended experience of being in a moment and letting it be what it was. The kneeling was not defeat. It was arrival. And that the relief available in surrender, in the genuine, open-handed release of the need to have it all figured out, is the kind of relief that does not require any particular outcome to be real. Let your body be heavy now. Let whatever is held begin to release. You do not have to have the right answer tonight. You just have to be willing to stop arguing with the question. That is enough. Chapter 27. The Wager of Attention. Every morning you make a wager, not consciously, not with deliberation, but in the first moments of the day, before you have fully decided what kind of day it is going to be, something is already being oriented toward distraction or toward presence, toward the noise or toward the real. Pascal's famous wager was about the disposition of a life, but there is a smaller version of it that plays out in every ordinary hour. And the smaller wager has the same structure. If you attend fully to what is actually here, the actual texture of this moment, this relationship, this feeling, this work, you might find something that the attended to reveals. Or you might find less than you hoped. But you will have been present for what is actual. If you do not attend fully, if you are here in body but absent in attention, scrolling through the next thing while the present thing passes, you will have safely avoided the risk of genuine encounter. But you will also have missed what was there. The asymmetry, as Pascal might have framed it, matters. The person who attends and finds less than they hoped loses something. The person who does not attend loses the same something with the additional loss of having chosen to lose it. Genuine attention is a risk. It opens you to being moved, being changed, being uncomfortable, being asked for something you were not planning to give. But it is also the only path to genuine encounter. And genuine encounter is the only thing that actually feeds the hunger Pascal spent his life naming. Not the hunger that diversions feed, the hunger of the anticipation system, the dopamine of the almost. But the deeper hunger, the one that requires reality, not simulation. Presence, not performance. There is a specific kind of tiredness that comes from a life lived mostly in the almost. The person who spent decades being in conversations without quite being in them, who was at the table but not at the table, whose eyes were there while their attention was somewhere else, who was technically present for most of the important moments of their life while being genuinely present for very few of them. That tiredness is not the tiredness of having done too much. It is the tiredness of having missed the thing while standing directly in front of it. Pascal would have recognized it. He described it differently, but the texture is the same. The human being who used every available moment of their finite life to avoid the only thing that could have actually satisfied the hunger they were trying to fill. The wager of attention is the invitation to try the other way. Not dramatically, not all at once, just here, in this hour, with what is actually in front of you. The attention you pay to this moment, right now, is a wager, not a large one. Not a dramatic one, but real. You are here with whatever this hour contains, and you are choosing to be present with it. Not because it is guaranteed to produce anything, because presence is, in itself, the thing that you were looking for when you lay down tonight. Not entertainment, not distraction, not the comfortable hum of provided stimulation. Just this, the actual room, the actual body, the actual mind doing what minds do at this hour. There is a kind of courage in that simplicity. Pascal would have recognized it. He would have said, that is the small wager that matters, not the grand gesture, not the dramatic conversion, just the repeated ordinary choice to be present with what is actually here. The choice not to reach for the next thing before this thing has been genuinely met. You have made that choice tonight by still being here. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly what Pascal was pointing toward. In all those cold rooms, in all those honest fragments, in all those years of trying to understand what the restlessness was telling him, it was telling him, be here, really here, in this room, right now. Chapter 28. Faith against restlessness. There is a peace that is not the absence of difficulty. Pascal was careful about this distinction. He had seen too much of life and felt too much of his own to believe that peace was something achieved by removing all the uncomfortable things. He was in pain for most of his adult years. He lost people he loved. He carried doubts that his intellect could not resolve, and questions that his faith could not always quiet. And yet, he wrote about peace, not as a destination he had not yet reached, but as something he had found in the middle of all of it, not in spite of the difficulty, not after the difficulty, in it. This is the counterintuitive truth at the center of Pascal's mature understanding. The restlessness does not need to be eliminated in order to find rest. The questions do not need to be answered in order to find peace. The longing does not need to be satisfied in order to live quietly and genuinely in the midst of the longing. The peace he described is not passive, it is not resignation. It is something more active, a decision made again each day to be oriented towards something real rather than something merely comforting. Viktor Frankl wrote, from an even more extreme position than Pascal, the same essential thing. He found that people who survived the camps were not the ones who had made their peace with what was happening to them by denying its horror. They were the ones who had found something, a person, a task, a meaning that their suffering could be organized around. Not resolved, organized. The suffering did not disappear. The relationship to it changed. Pascal's faith was his organization principle, not a theology that answered every question, but a direction that made the questions bearable. A way of being in the world that allowed for the full, honest experience of the human condition, the wretchedness, the grandeur, the longing, the finitude, without being destroyed by any of it. What is your organization principle? Not the metaphysical version necessarily, the practical one. What is the thing, the relationship, the value, the purpose, the love around which the difficult things can be organized without dissolving you? Most people have one, even if they have never named it explicitly. The parent who endures enormous difficulty for the sake of a child. The person who stays in a hard situation because something they believe in requires it. The craftsperson who returns to the difficult work because the work itself is worth it. These are not philosophical positions. They are acts of faith. Faith that the thing worth orienting around is real enough to be worth the organizing. And here is what is useful about naming the principle rather than leaving it unnamed. The unnamed organization principle does its work invisibly. You orient toward it without knowing you are orienting. You make sacrifices for it without calling them sacrifices. You draw strength from it without recognizing the source. This is not inefficient. Exactly. The unnamed principle can sustain a person for years, but it cannot sustain them in the moments when the cost becomes visible, when what the organization principle requires becomes harder than expected. When the doubt arrives, and doubt always arrives eventually, and there is nothing explicitly named to return to, the person who has named their organization principle has something to hold in those moments. Not a proof, not a certainty, just a name, a direction they have explicitly chosen that they can explicitly re-choose when the choosing becomes difficult. Pascal named his. He wrote it down. He sewed it into the lining of his coat, not for anyone else, for himself, for the moments when the quiet room became hard. Pascal would say, "The orientation is available whether or not you have certainty about its object. You do not have to know with proof that the love is returned, or the work will matter, or the direction is the right one. You just have to keep choosing it, and choosing it again and again, in the ordinary days, is itself the thing that makes it real. Let the breath come slow and full. There is something in your life worth orienting around. You do not have to name it tonight. Just notice that it is there, and let it hold you for a while." Chapter 29. Inner Peace and Finitude. Seneca wrote a short book near the end of his life called On the Shortness of Life. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He was the tutor of emperors. He had more resources available to him than almost any person alive. And he wrote in that book that most people spend their entire lives in a state of anxious busyness and then are surprised at the end to discover they had no time. Not because life is short, but because so much of it is spent in distraction from life. He wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it." Pascal would have agreed entirely. But he would have added something Seneca did not quite reach, that the acceptance of finitude, genuine felt acceptance, not the intellectual acknowledgement, but the body level settling into the fact that this is actually how it is, can produce something surprising. Not grief, not resignation, relief. There is an enormous amount of energy spent in the ordinary human life, in the management of the fact of finitude, the subtle, chronic resistance to the reality that time is not unlimited. The decisions made from a kind of low-grade terror about getting the life wrong, about wasting it, about reaching the end and finding that the important things were missed, this resistance is not useful. It does not slow the passing of time. It does not extend the years available. It does not make the choices any clearer. What it does is consume an enormous portion of the attention that could be directed at the life that is actually here. The person who has genuinely accepted that their time is limited not as an intellectual position, but as a felt reality, often experiences a shift in attention that looks from the outside like serenity. They are not serenely indifferent to the world. They are serenely present in it. Because the energy that was spent managing the resistance to finitude has been freed, and it has been freed for presence, for the conversation that deserves real attention. For the ordinary Tuesday, that is, when you stop managing your awareness of its ordinariness, actually more interesting than expected. For the relationship that is right here, asking for nothing more than your honest presence. Pascal wrote about preparing for death not as a morbid practice, but as a clarifying one. Marcus Aurelius, in his journal, reminded himself repeatedly, you could leave life right now. He was not being dramatic. He was being useful. The reminder of finitude is the reminder of what matters, not in the breathless, urgent, productivity-maximizing sense, in the quieter sense. What is worth being present for? What is worth the attention when attention is known to be limited? Often, the answer is something very ordinary. There is a story that belongs to many people, in many variations. A person receives news that changes the quality of the time in front of them. Not necessarily catastrophic news, just real news. The kind that makes the abstract fact of finitude suddenly concrete. And in the days after, something shifts in how they move through ordinary things. The morning coffee becomes more itself. Not more dramatic, just more present. The light in the kitchen is noticed in a way it was not noticed the week before. A conversation with someone they love goes deeper than expected, and they let it. Rather than pulling it back toward the surface, they are not performing gratitude. They are simply no longer managing the awareness of time, and the managing, it turns out, was taking up an enormous portion of their attention. Attention that has now been freed for the thing itself. Pascal was not advocating for the seeking of difficult news. He was pointing at the same clarity that difficult news sometimes produces, and asking, what would it look like to have access to that clarity without the emergency? What would it look like to simply know, quietly and continuously, that the time here is real and limited and worth being genuinely present for? The room you are in right now. The person sleeping nearby, or the solitude you have earned. The body that is still carrying you imperfectly through the years. Let finitude be a gift tonight. Not the gift of urgency. The gift of permission. Permission to be here, exactly here, without needing this moment to be more than it is. It is enough. You are enough. The time that is left is not the point. The time that is here is the point, and here is where you are. Chapter 30, when silence becomes prayer. There is a kind of listening that is different from waiting for the next thought. Most of us listen. The way we read something, we are skimming. tracking for the parts that are relevant, the words that will help us respond, the information that fits into what we already know. This kind of listening is useful. It is the listening of functioning in the world. But there is another kind, the kind that does not know what it is listening for, that approaches the silence without an agenda, that is genuinely open to whatever is actually there rather than whatever the prior organization of the mind would find useful. Pascal arrived at this kind of listening through his theology. He called it a form of prayer, not the petition prayer of asking for specific outcomes, but something more like orientation, turning toward something in the quiet without requiring it to produce anything specific. This second kind of listening is available regardless of theology. It is available in any room, to any person, at any hour. You do not need a particular belief to practice it. You need only the willingness to be genuinely quiet, not the managed quiet of a person waiting for their thoughts to organize themselves into something useful. The actual quiet of a person who has, for a few minutes, released the project of managing the experience. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote of the breath as an anchor, not a technique, an anchor. Something that is always there, always real, always happening, regardless of what the mind is doing around it. And when you return to the breath, not once with discipline, but again and again, as many times as it takes, with patience rather than frustration, you are performing the gentlest possible version of Pascal's orientation. You are turning toward what is actually here, not toward the scenario you are rehearsing, not toward the regret you are reviewing, not toward the future you are managing, toward the present thing, the breath, the room, the quality of the dark, the specific weight of this hour. When silence becomes prayer, it does not require a deity. It requires only this: a genuine release of the need to be anywhere other than here. Think of the last time you were genuinely, completely absorbed in something. Not entertained. Absorption is different from entertainment. Entertainment requires an entertainer. Absorption requires only the thing and you. The conversation that took an unexpected turn and suddenly you were fully in it, not managing it. The piece of music that arrived at exactly the right moment. The moment in the garden or on the walk or in the kitchen when something settled without announcement, and for a few minutes you were simply and entirely where you were. That is the posture Pascal was describing. Not a technique, a state that becomes available when the project of directing the experience is temporarily suspended, when you stop being the manager of the moment and simply become present in it. Most people have had this experience. Most people would not describe it as prayer, but Pascal would say it is the same orientation, the same turning, the same release of the defended, managing, self-directing posture into something more open. And here is the thing about it. You cannot force it. Effort in the direction of this state produces the opposite of this state. The person trying hard to be present is, by the effort of the trying, absent from the trying. What works is something softer. Intention without insistence. Turning without grasping. The restlessness does not disappear. It may still be present quietly at the edges, but it becomes the background rather than the foreground. The noise in the other room rather than the noise in this one, and in the foreground something else. The texture of what actually is. Breath, weight, dark, still, ordinary and, in its ordinariness, profound. Pascal found this in his cold rooms. Montaigne found it in his tower. Thoreau found it by a pond in Massachusetts in July, in a one-room cabin with no one who needed him, discovering for the first time in his life what space actually felt like without occupation. They were all, in their different ways, doing the same thing, turning toward the silence that is not empty, the silence that is full of what is real. You are in that silence right now. Let the next breath come slowly, and then the next. There is nothing else required of you tonight. This is enough. This is, in fact, everything. Chapter 31. Solitude without loneliness. At the beginning of this night, there were two kinds of silence. This is the second one. Not the silence that frightens, not the silence that exposes uncomfortably the things we have been avoiding, not the silence of an empty room that reveals an emptier self. This is the other silence, the one Pascal was moving toward in all his honest fragments, the one that is not absence but presence, the one that does not reveal what is missing but what is actually here. Solitude without loneliness is a particular achievement, not in the sense of something earned through discipline or developed through years of practice, though both of those things can help. In the sense of something recognized, a quality of awareness that becomes available when you stop requiring solitude to be something other than what it is. Loneliness is the experience of being alone and finding it insufficient, of wanting company that is not present, of feeling the absence of connection as a kind of deficit. Solitude, genuine solitude, is the experience of being alone and finding it complete, not better than company. Not proof that company is unnecessary, just complete in itself. A different kind of fullness than what connection provides. Montaigne, in his tower, discovered something about solitude that he had not expected. He had retreated to be alone. But what he found in aloneness was not himself in isolation. He found himself in conversation with the writers whose books lined his walls, with the questions they had not answered, with his own thoughts as they emerged in the unusual space of uninterrupted quiet. He was alone. He was also in extremely good company. The writers who have written most honestly about solitude, Thoreau by his pond, Rilke in his letters to a young poet, Merton in his monastery, Woolf in her insistence on a room of one's own describe something similar. Not the absence of the world in the quiet, but the presence of something in the quiet that the world's noise usually obscures. A fullness that is not the fullness of satisfaction or entertainment. A fullness that comes from simply being present with what is actually here. The self, in genuine solitude, is not diminished by the absence of external stimulation. It expands, not dramatically, not in a way that produces ecstasy or revelation. Quietly, the way a plant expands in good conditions. Not dramatically, but steadily, in the direction of what it is. You have been expanding tonight, in your own way. Perhaps you have not been aware of it. Perhaps the ideas have washed over you more than they have landed. Perhaps you drifted at some point and came back and drifted again. That is exactly right. That is precisely the relationship to solitude that Pascal was describing. Not effortful, not disciplined, just present. You are not alone right now in any threatening sense. You are alone in the best possible sense. The sense of being genuinely present with yourself in a quiet room, in the company of ideas and images and the honest texture of this particular hour. That is what Pascal was looking for. That is what you found tonight, without necessarily looking for it. And here is the small truth that changes it. You can return here, not as an achievement to maintain, not as a state to perfect, but as a direction you know, a room you have visited, a quality of quiet that you now know the address of. This matters more than it might sound, because most of us across a life will move through periods that make solitude difficult or impossible. Years of intense responsibility, of children who need, of work that demands, of crises that absorb. Years when the quiet room is genuinely unavailable, not through avoidance, but through genuine circumstance. In those years, the person who has visited the room, who knows what it feels like, who has some cellular memory of the quality of the quiet, carries something with them that the person who has never visited does not have. They carry the knowledge that it is there. And that knowledge changes, slightly but genuinely, the relationship to the noise. It makes the noise less total, less absolute. Because somewhere in the body is the memory of what the noise is covering. Pascal wrote his fragments in whatever gaps his illness allowed. He carried the quiet room with him through the years when he could not always enter it. And when he could, in the stretches of enforced rest, in the evenings when the pain allowed it, he returned there as a person who knew exactly where they were. That is the solitude without loneliness that is available to you, not constantly, not perfectly, but as a direction you know, and a room that is always here. It is here whenever the noise of the days becomes too much to carry. It was always here. Chapter 32. Suffering, Truth, and Blaise Pascal suffered. Not abstractly, not philosophically, in the body. In the concrete, specific reality of pain that interrupts thought, that prevents sleep, that makes the ordinary pleasures of a day unavailable, he was sick, almost chronically, from his early 20s onward. Migraines that lasted for days. A digestive weakness that made it difficult to eat. In his last years, he was in almost constant pain, unable to work at the intensity he had always worked, unable to maintain the projects he had started. He died at 39. And in all of this, he wrote not with bitterness, but with something harder to name, a kind of honesty that had been sharpened by the experience of suffering rather than dissolved by it. He did not write about his pain directly. He was not that kind of writer. But you can read the suffering in the urgency of his fragments, in the sense that he was writing quickly against something. In the pieces that seem to have been written in the brief gaps between illness, when his mind was clear and he had things to say that the pain might not give him time to finish, he was not a stoic in the technical sense. He did not advocate for the suppression of feeling or the cultivation of indifference to pain. He was something else. A person who had found that suffering, honestly met, had a quality that comfortable life could not produce. Clarity. Not the cheerful clarity of a person who has solved the problem and moved on. The harder clarity of a person who has been close enough to the limit of what they can endure to know exactly what matters and what does not. This is the mercy that suffering sometimes carries. Not the mercy of relief, not the mercy of rescue, but the mercy of reduction, of stripping away everything that is not essential and leaving you in direct contact with what is. Think of the person who spent a year navigating something genuinely hard. Not a dramatic, story-worthy crisis, just the sustained difficulty of something that did not resolve quickly, that required them to keep going without the assurance that the going would end well. In that year, some things fell away, not because they decided to drop them, because they no longer had the energy to maintain them. The peripheral relationships that had been absorbing attention without returning anything real. The professional ambitions that had been organized more around other people's expectations than genuine desire. The performance of being fine that had cost quietly an enormous amount. When the difficulty finally passed, these things did not return. Not all of them, and in their absence, something simpler emerged. A life with fewer moving parts, but more genuine ones. A smaller circle, but a more honest one. Less busy, but more present. The person would not have chosen the year, they would not recommend the method, but they also could not honestly say that nothing had come of it. Pascal would have recognized that accounting. The years that have been difficult for you, and if you have lived long enough to be listening to this, you have had some, have done something similar. Even if it did not feel like a gift at the time. even if it still does not entirely feel like one. They have clarified. They have taught you, perhaps without your permission, what actually matters, what you can live without, and what you cannot. Who is genuinely present when the easy times are not available, and who disappears. What the difference is between something you want and something you need. Pascal would say that knowledge is not the consolation prize of suffering. It is the actual prize. The thing that makes a life coherent rather than comfortable, honest rather than pleasant. Not that comfort and pleasure are bad. He did not think that. He thought they were insufficient. And suffering, by removing them temporarily, reveals what remains underneath. What remains underneath, Pascal found, is something more solid than the comfortable things that had been stacked on top of it. Something worth building on. Let the years settle for a moment. The ones that were hard, the ones you would not choose to repeat, they are also yours. They are also part of what made you the person who is here tonight. And the person who is here tonight has survived everything that was supposed to be. Impossible. That is not nothing. That is the most honest kind of greatness there is. Chapter 33. The Soul Without Diversion. Imagine a morning when there is nowhere to be, no alarm, no schedule, no one who needs anything. Just the early light and the silence and the first minutes of the day before any of the usual occupation arrives. What is there in those minutes before the diversion begins? This is what Pascal was asking, not philosophically, practically, in the lived experience of the self, before it has been given a task to organize itself around, before the day's identity has been assumed and the social self has been assembled, and the various projects of being you have been resumed. What is there? He did not think the answer was nothing. He did not think the answer was chaos or emptiness or the threatening void that diversion is deployed to prevent. He thought the answer was the soul, not in a mystical sense that requires particular beliefs, in the sense that he used the word to describe the most honest, least performed, most essential version of a human person. The self before the project of the self. And the soul, he wrote, without diversion is not destroyed, it is revealed. It is quieter than expected. Smaller than the performance of the self, in some ways, without the equipment of identity and reputation and social role, the essential self is a surprisingly ordinary creature, uncertain, hoping, fragile, in possession of more love than it usually displays and more fear than it usually admits, and also more alive than the busy performance of being alive usually allows. There is someone who sat with this. One particular Sunday morning, when the plans fell through and the children were elsewhere and the work was finished and there was nothing to do, he sat in his kitchen with a cup of something warm and, for perhaps the first time in years, did not reach for anything to fill the quiet. The first 5 minutes were uncomfortable. The mind circled. The hand moved twice toward the phone and twice came back. And then something settled. Not dramatically, not with revelation, just settled. A quality of presence arrived that had been waiting, apparently, for some time. The kitchen looked the same. The light through the window was ordinary, but he was genuinely in it, not managing it, not planning what came next. Just here. He sat for 40 minutes. He thought of nothing of consequence. Afterward, he could not explain why it had felt significant. Only that it had. That something had been fed that he had not known was hungry. Pascal would have nodded. That is the soul without diversion, not dramatic, not mystical. Just the self, finally present to itself in an ordinary room. This is the room at the center of everything Pascal wrote. Not the cold room in Paris where he spent his difficult winters. The interior room. The room that diversion exists to keep you from visiting. The room where the soul, without its usual occupation, is simply present. And in that presence, something honest happens. You stop trying to be adequate to some imagined standard. You stop managing the gap between who you are and who you are supposed to be. You stop performing, even for yourself. And what is left, what has always been left, underneath all the performance and the management and the diversion, is the person who has been here the whole time. Imperfect and genuine and present. You are in that room right now. This room, tonight, has been the interior room. The ideas have been the occasion. But the room has been real. And the person in the room has been you, without occupation, without the project of being someone specific, without the noise that usually fills the silence. Just here, just this. Pascal spent 39 years looking for this room. You have been in it for hours. Let the recognition of that rest with you for a moment. You do not have to do anything with it. You just have to notice that you have found it and that you can find it again whenever you need it. In any quiet room, in any honest hour. It has always been here, and so have you. Chapter 34. Learning to remain still. Let us pause here for a moment, not to meditate, not to fix anything, not to resolve what has been raised tonight, just to be present with what is actually here. The ideas of this night have been moving through you like weather. Some of them landed and you felt their weight. Some of them passed without settling. Some of them will return quietly in a day or a week, having found their place in you without your arranging it. All of that is fine. All of that is exactly right. Right now, there is only this. Your body is somewhere. It is resting in some position it found for itself. Without your instruction, it has been managing the extraordinary, ordinary project of keeping you alive. Breathing, circulating, adjusting to the temperature of the room, holding you in the simple fact of being here. Let your attention move to wherever your body feels heaviest. Maybe the shoulders, maybe the hips, maybe the back of the head where it meets what is beneath it. Just notice. There is nothing to change. You are not doing this wrong. Your body is not wrong. It is simply here. And here is exactly where it needs to be. Let your breath find its own rhythm. You do not need to make it deeper or slower or more correct. Just let it move the way it wants to move. The breath was never waiting for your instruction. It was doing this all along. If your mind is still busy, still turning over the ideas, still revisiting the questions, still generating the next thought, that is fine. Let the mind be busy in the background, like a radio playing in another room. You can hear it. It is not a problem. You do not need to go turn it off. You are not in that room. You are in this room, the room where your body is heavy, where your breath moves on its own, where the quiet is not empty, but full of the specific reality of this moment. Pascal described the soul without diversion as something that had always been there, waiting, patient, beneath the noise. Right now, you are giving it room, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that requires anything of you, just by being still enough that what has always been here can come slightly to the surface. Let it. You have been carrying the day and the week, and perhaps in ways you have not entirely accounted for, the years. You can set them down for a while. They will be exactly where you left them when you are ready to pick them up again. But right now, they do not need to be carried. They can rest beside you, and you can rest. The room is quiet. You are here. That is all that is required, and that is, it turns out, more than enough. Chapter 35. A Lamp in Darkness. What Pascal found in his quiet room was not a solution. It was a direction. That direction is what we have been exploring tonight. And it does not require a monastery or a philosopher's certainty or the dramatic conversion of a November fire. It requires only the willingness, repeated across ordinary days, to be present with what is actually here. Here is a gentle path. 7 days. Simple. You do not need to do all of it. You do not need to do any of it perfectly. Each day is a small offering, not a requirement. Day 1, today. Just notice one moment when you reach for distraction, not to judge it, not to refuse it, just to see it, to say, silently, there you are, I can see you now. The reach toward the phone, the screen, the noise. Just notice it once. That is everything for today. Day 2. At some point today, find 2 minutes of genuine quiet. Not silence with a podcast in the background, not quiet while checking the phone. 2 minutes of nothing added. Let whatever surfaces in those 2 minutes surface. You do not have to engage with it. You just have to let it be there. Day 3. Today, when something is difficult, when the anxiety hums, or the restlessness arrives, or the familiar heaviness settles in, try not to immediately replace it with something. Instead, say to yourself, simply, "This is the honest thing. I am feeling the honest thing. Nothing needs to be fixed right now," and then see what happens. Day 4. Think of one question you have been avoiding. Not the enormous existential ones. A practical one. Something you have been meaning to think about but have been successfully not thinking about. Today, give it 5 minutes of genuine attention. Not to solve it. To acknowledge that it is there. Day 5. Today, do one thing with genuine, full attention. One meal, one conversation, one walk. Not with the other half of your attention somewhere else. Just this thing, fully. Notice what it is like to be completely present for something ordinary. Day 6. Tonight, before sleep, pause for a moment. Not to review the day critically, just to notice what was actually here today. What was the quality of it? Not whether it was successful, whether it was real, and let whatever is honest about your answer be honored. Day 7. Tonight, remember this. The quiet room that felt uncomfortable at the beginning of this week has been present all along. It did not go anywhere. It was here on the mornings when you filled it, and here on the evenings when you did not. It is always here. And you can always return to it, not as an achievement, just as a direction you know. Pascal sat in his cold rooms and found that the silence honestly entered was not empty. It was full of what was real. You know this now too. And knowing it is enough to carry forward gently, without urgency, one quiet moment at a time. Chapter 36. The Quiet Room Within. This is where we return to the beginning. The night was already here when this started, and the night is here still. The darkness outside is the same darkness. The room you are in has not changed. What has changed, perhaps, is your relationship to the quiet in it. At the beginning of tonight, there was the hum, the restlessness, the small engine that kept turning even when the day had finished asking things of you. Pascal's diversion was present in you, as it is present in everyone, in the constant, almost involuntary reaching away from the silence. And we followed Pascal into his cold rooms to understand what he found when he stopped reaching. We found, with him, the human condition in its honesty, the wretchedness and the grandeur, the smallness and the scale, the finite creature who can conceive of the infinite and who finds, in the gap between those two things, the restlessness that no diversion has ever fully healed. We found the performance that most of us give without deciding to. The theater of vanity, the need for applause, the careful maintenance of a self that the quiet room does not require. We found the body's craving for motion, the mind's brilliant capacity for simulation, the heart's knowledge that arrives before the argument. And we found, underneath all of it, something that Pascal believed was the most important thing, the soul without diversion, the self that has always been here before the project of being someone specific, before the reputation and the schedule and the daily performance of competence and adequacy, beneath the noise. Just here. Just this. You have been here for hours tonight, in the room Pascal was writing about. Not literally in his cold Paris study. In the interior room that he was always pointing toward. The room that diversion exists to keep you away from because the quiet in it is so honest that the performance cannot be maintained within it. In this room, you are simply yourself, whatever that is tonight. Whatever combination of tired and hopeful and unresolved and grateful and uncertain, whatever version of your years has shown up in this hour, all of it is welcome here. None of it needs to be corrected before it is allowed to rest. Pascal was 39 years old when he died. He left behind a box of fragments, hundreds of small pieces of paper and parchment, some barely legible, some in a state of compression that required years of scholarly effort to decode. The book he intended to write was never written. The arguments he meant to make remained incomplete. What survived was exactly what survived. The honest fragments, the pieces he wrote in the gaps between illness and argument and experiment. The things he could not stop saying because they were true. And one of the truest things he said was this: the human heart is restless. It reaches constantly for more than the available quiet seems to offer. And in that reaching, it misses what the quiet was always holding, which is the fullest version of what you actually are, not the version you manage and present and perform. The version that breathes and doubts and loves and endures and keeps showing up even in the years that have been harder than you expected. That version is here tonight. That version has been here all along. The restlessness may return tomorrow. The diversion will probably begin again before breakfast. The noise of the ordinary days will reassemble itself around you, as it always does, and the quiet room will recede behind it. But you know the way back now. It is not far. It is never far. It is in any room where you are willing to be simply, honestly present. Just here, just this, just you. Pascal spent his whole short life learning to stay in that room. Tonight, you stayed in it too. And the quiet that held you here, the silence that is not empty, but full of what is real, will be here whenever you return. It will not have moved. It was always your room. Sleep now.